Russia often parades itself as a military colossus, boasting the world's second-largest army that's brimming with an arsenal that should dominate on paper. It has the second strongest air force, only behind the United States, and an inventory of tanks and artillery that no other country can match. Its naval fleet, loaded with more corvettes and submarines than anyone else, should make it a titan in conventional warfare. Yet, the ongoing conflict in Ukraine paints a drastically different picture. Despite overwhelming numerical superiority and massive firepower, Russia struggles to secure a decisive victory over a significantly smaller opponent. This glaring discrepancy between expectation and reality begs the question: just how effective are Russian weapons on the global stage? Part of the reason may come down to Russia's tactics, with another reason being that Ukraine has received substantial support from Western countries as it tries to fend off President Vladimir Putin's ambitions. But there's another reason why Russia's army isn't as strong in practice as it is on paper. Many Russian weapons are bad. So bad that they've failed to keep up with what the West is producing, leading to Russia's soldiers in Ukraine facing heavy losses. It wasn't this way in the past. At the height of the Cold War, Russia's weapons had a reputation for being robust and well-made. They may have well lacked all the bells and whistles associated with American weapons, but they did what they needed to do on the battlefield. They worked. Take the T-34 tank as an example. Introduced in 1940, the T-34 went on to become Russia's most successful tank. It was also a masterclass in innovation, becoming the first modern tank to feature sloped armor, which makes it harder for anti-tank weapons to penetrate the vehicle's shell, and featuring an independent suspension system that made it more maneuverable. That innovation in design, coupled with a focus on functionality, would be a hallmark of Russian weaponry for years to come. The country built nuclear submarines, fighter jets, and could compete with the best the United States had to offer, and perhaps most famously, the AK-47 Kalashnikov. Often considered one of the world's most reliable rifles, the AK-47 and its variants have sold 100 million units, and according to military.com, is still the standard infantry weapon for 106 countries. Those kinds of sales don't happen for a poor weapon. They're also indicative of Russian military exports in the past. Through the 1980s, Russia was one of the world's leading weapons exporters, only trailing the United States in terms of pure volume sold. Visual Capitalist provides interesting data here, demonstrating that Russia's weapons exports hovered around the $40 billion per year mark throughout much of the 1980s, before falling to the $30 billion point in 1990 and never recovering. Again, those kinds of sales don't happen unless the buyers are happy with the product, and a happy buyer, in military terms, should indicate that a country is producing good weapons, or in Russia's case, was producing good weapons. The fact is that Russian weapon sales have been declining steadily for years. We saw a hint of this in the 2010s, with Visual Capitalist showing that Russia's exports dropped below the $20 billion mark between 2000 and 2004, less than half of the sales being achieved during the 1980s. A recovery in the years that followed pushed Russia's exports back up to the $30 billion mark. But in more recent years, Russia's weapon exports have declined dramatically. Of course, some could argue that this is only logical. Russia is engaged in a long conflict with Ukraine, so it's only natural that the country will be stockpiling weapons to send to its troops rather than selling them to other countries. And that would make sense were it not for the fact that the decline began long before Putin invaded Ukraine. According to GIS, a geopolitical analysis and forecasting company, Russia's share of the global arms market dropped from 22% between 2013 and 17 down to 16% between 2018 and 22. You'll note these are the 4 years leading up to the Ukraine war, showing that the world's opinions on Russian weapons were declining well before the conflict began. The loss of so many sales to India has been the lowlight of this period of decline for Russia's arms industry. Between 2018 and 22, sales to India dropped by 37%. This mirrors the level of sales to 7 more of Russia's 10 largest customers, which collectively dropped by an average of 59%. Only China and Egypt were buying more weapons from Russia between 2018 and 22 than they were between 2013 and 17. This leads us to an obvious question: why the decline? An April 2024 article in Politico theorizes that the Ukraine war has exposed Russia's weapons for what they really are, revealing its military and weapons-making competence to be a myth. Simply put, those weapons don't live up to the reputation they had during the Soviet era. It also points to India as its main example of the global attitude toward modern Russian weaponry. The country spent $60 billion on Russian weapons over the last 20 years, but the figure is declining dramatically. Between 2009 and 2013, Russia accounted for 76% of India's weapon imports. Between 2018 and 2023, that figure was halved. Russia only accounted for 36% of the weapons India bought. The reason? Russia's weapons are old and failing. That's according to a dossier compiled by Ukraine's Ministry of Defense, which examined Russian weapons recovered from the battlefield to reveal that most are unreliable at best and utterly fail to meet modern standards at worst. The dossier claims that Russia's helicopters and armored vehicles are so weak that many are unable to withstand small arms fire. Plus, its missiles are inaccurate. Ukraine claims they only have a 33% chance of hitting their targets. In an August 2022 statement, a global affairs analyst named Emisakourou Donatus honed in on the Ka-52 Alligator attack helicopter as an example. Often lauded as Russia's most modern helicopter, the Ka-52 is supposed to be equivalent to a flying tank that has a cabin capable of shrugging off direct hits from 12.7mm caliber bullets with no problems. The reality is much different, as Donatus explains. However, as it turns out in practice, the Ka-52 can be disabled with a 7.62mm machine gun. That's a far cry from a flying tank, showing that Russia's weapons often don't live up to the claims the country makes about them. Perhaps that's why so many countries are looking elsewhere to source their weapons. They can see through Russia's smokescreen, especially once they have these failing weapons in their hands. The Ka-52 is just one example. Let's move on to a more in-depth examination of some of Russia's weapons, starting with a piece of equipment that's meant to be a jewel in the country's crown, the T-90 tank. Created during the late Soviet era, the T-90 was a massive upgrade over the older T-72 and T-80 tanks in Russia's arsenal. And for the time at least, it was among the best tanks in the world. Featuring reactive and advanced composite armor, along with a 125mm gun and a fire control system that was as modern as they came, it looked every inch the modern tank on paper. But long before the Ukraine war, it was already starting to be exposed. Russia's conflicts in Chechnya and Syria revealed that the T-90 was susceptible to most modern anti-tank systems. Once drones became more prominent on the battlefield, it was proven to be even more vulnerable. According to the National Interest, the Chechen and Syrian fighters who came up against it say that you don't even necessarily need a modern form of attack to take out a T-90. A standard rocket-propelled grenade, or RPG, will do the job more often than not. The Ukraine war has exposed the T-90 even further. Not only does it have to face the RPG fire that the Chechens and the Syrians used to destroy several of the tanks, but it also has to contend with modern anti-tank systems like the Javelin. Striking from above, the Javelin is capable of easily penetrating a T-90's armor, leaving it a destroyed shell. Ukraine had received 7,000 Javelins from the United States by April 2022, and it's used them to wreak havoc on Russia's tanks ever since. Russia hasn't been able to respond effectively to this type of anti-tank weaponry. In October 2023, Forbes reported that Russia had lost over 2,100 tanks in Ukraine up to that point, with the T-90 accounting for about 60 of those losses. That in itself is revealing. If the T-90 is supposed to be Russia's best tank, why has it sent so few into Ukraine compared to its other, much older tanks? The situation has gotten so bad, according to Forbes, that Russia has been forced to reactivate T-72s, T-62s, and even T-54s and T-55s. Some of those tanks are around 70 years old. And it gets worse. So desperate is Russia to defend its tanks against modern anti-tank weapons that it started relying on what the media mockingly calls cope cages. Vice reports that these cages, which appear to be hastily built using everyday materials before being haphazardly placed over the tank's turret, were first seen in November 2021, when Russian tanks started rolling into Crimea. Lacking any uniformity in their design, the cages appeared to be a desperate attempt to defend against weapons like the Javelin. The concept is simple enough. A javelin that would otherwise hit a tank hits the cage, with the explosion that follows failing to penetrate the tank. The cope cages haven't worked. If they did, Russia wouldn't have lost well over 2,000 tanks in Ukraine. The entire situation points to Russia having failed to update its tanks so they're capable of dealing with modern anti-tank weapons. In the case of the T-90, it's not necessarily a bad tank. Certainly not in the context of the Ukraine war, as Ukraine has been forced to rely on T-62 and T-72 models. According to a Ukrainian lieutenant named Oleksandr Romanchuk, it takes 2 or 3 of those older tanks to stand a chance against the T-90. Rather, it seems like the T-90 is a relic of a form of war that's increasingly not being fought anymore. It may still come out on top when stacked against many other tanks, especially those designed before it, but it's a crowning jewel from the Soviet era that's being repeatedly shattered by anti-tank weapons against which it was never designed to have a proper defense. Let's switch focus to Russia's missiles. Earlier you heard Emisakaru Donatis's claims that Russia's missiles aren't particularly accurate. He dug deeper into this claim back in 2022, claiming that expert evaluations of Russian missiles in Ukrainian territory found that the 3M-14 caliber cruise missile, which was launched from the sea, had just a 33% chance of hitting its target. Worse yet, around 30% of these missiles hit civilian targets, rather than the military targets at which they're aimed. A March 2022 report published in Reuters seems to back those claims up. It quoted 2 US officials who spoke on condition of anonymity, and their claims that Russia's missiles were suffering failure rates of up to 60% during the first 2 months of the war. Reuters speculated that these failure rates could be why Russia failed to establish early aerial control, despite having a much larger military. Furthermore, it's why Russia struggled to capture targets quickly in the days before Ukraine was receiving regular support from the West. For context, the US estimated that Russia fired 1,100 missiles into Ukraine up to March 25, 2022. If the 60% failure rate is accurate, that means 660 of those missiles either failed to hit their targets or didn't detonate when they did. According to the military experts Reuters spoke to, a failure rate of 20% would be considered high. A rate of 60% is catastrophic. Defense News speculates that, much as we've seen with Russian tanks, the country's missiles have failed to keep pace with modern developments. In May 2023, it noted that Russian missile strikes against Ukrainian infrastructure were becoming less frequent. That was after a year of the country growing increasingly reliant on missile strikes, which was less a sign that the strikes were working and more a sign that Russia wasn't achieving its objectives. The outlet claims that a typical missile-heavy strategy would see an early bombardment, as we saw during the first months of the war, that would slow down once the missiles had done their job of destroying vital infrastructure and military locations. That's not what happened. A combination of poor Russian intelligence and a lack of modern targeting capabilities, Defense News says, is responsible for this. Simply put, Russian missiles are too easy for Ukraine to shoot down, assuming they even reach their targets in the first place. Perhaps that's why Russia is increasingly relying on older weapons such as its glide bombs to wreak havoc on Ukraine. The country has been taken to converting old 1.5-ton Fab 1500 and 3.4-ton Fab 3000 bombs by attaching wings to them. The bombs are launched from behind the front lines, with the wings allowing them to glide somewhere close to their targets. They're not particularly accurate, at least compared to the modern accuracy such a modern missile should have. But even if they don't hit their target exactly, they produce such a large explosion that they still cause massive damage. While you could say the use of these old bombs represents a stroke of ingenuity by the Russians, it's also an unintentional confession. Our missiles aren't doing the job, so we've had to come up with other ways to attack Ukraine. So Russia's tanks and missiles are clearly showing their age, and are failing at rates nobody expected before the war in Ukraine began. But it gets worse for Russia. Its air force is struggling just as much as its ground troops. In February 2024, the BBC reported that Ukraine has shot down a staggering 342 Russian planes, along with 325 of its helicopters. That's an embarrassing figure for a country that's supposed to have the second strongest air force in the world. And again, Emisakaru Donatis highlighted one of the reasons why this might be happening when speaking about the Ka-52 earlier. Russia's flying tank can be taken down with fairly standard munitions, and it doesn't stop there. According to an October 2023 article on Breaking Defense, the Russian Aerospace Forces, or VKS, are struggling with availability rates after losing so many of its aircraft. But even more worrying for the VKS is that many of the planes it's losing aren't its older, Soviet-era Sukhoi and MiG fighters. The more modern Sukhoi models are just as prone to being shot down as the outdated jets it's sending into Ukraine. Breaking Defense goes on to report the accumulation of flight hours in many of Russia's older planes, such as the Su-34, were already in excess of the country's pre-war projections. Those craft are being forced to log more hours in the sky than they were designed to manage, essentially meaning they're running on fumes from a mechanical perspective. That increase in hours also creates a need for more maintenance, with the UK's Ministry of Defence pointing out that this is a problem for the VKS too. This need for extra maintenance is complicated by a shortage of spare parts because of increasing demand and international sanctions. An August 2023 report by RAND offers more details. It says that Russia finds itself in a position where it's still trying to transition away from the Soviet-era aircraft that made it such a powerful aerial force during the Cold War era. It's also struggling to bring new aircraft online. Around half of Russia's fleet is made up of upgraded Soviet-era planes because it isn't able to build new aerial assets quickly enough. So we see the same situation that we saw with Russia's tanks. The country is relying on technology from a bygone military era, which could explain why the VKS has been so unsuccessful in Ukraine. As for flight hours, the Soviet-era platforms Russia is using so extensively in the war are generally designed to fly for between 2,000 and 3,500 hours. That's far below the 3,500 to 4,500 hours most modern military aircraft can manage. And even with upgrading efforts potentially extending lifespans, RAND says that many of the planes Russia is losing are already deep within the last 1,000 hours of their service lives. By the summer of 2024, the organization says the VKS will be down to 75% of its pre-war strength due to combat losses and many of its aircraft's airframes simply aging out. Even more worryingly for Russia, the story doesn't seem to get much better for its newer planes. Take the Su-57 as an example. A stealth fighter that's supposed to be among the best fifth-generation fighters in the world today, the Su-57 basically hasn't been used in Ukraine. Part of that is down to Russia simply not having many of the aircraft. It only had 10 available to the VKS at the beginning of 2023. But even then, 10 Su-57s should have been able to wreak havoc on Ukraine. Russia claims the jet is one of the best of its kind, as well as being the first Russian jet to feature stealth technology. It should be featured in the war, but it isn't. And the reason may lie in the array of technical issues the jet had faced during its development. On paper, the Su-57 is supposed to be a combination of attack aircraft and fighter jet, capable of destroying targets on land, at sea, or in the air. Its body is made using composite materials including fiberglass, polymers, and a special aluminium used to create load-bearing honeycomb filters. It can also carry up to 4 K-77M missiles, each radar-guided and being launchable from beyond visual range. A combination of twin engines cooled by Izdalai 117 or AL-41F1 turbofans and 3D thrust vectors should give it immense maneuverability while still allowing it to reach Mach 2 without engaging afterburners. However, the reality is much different. Production problems mean that the Su-57, which was first flown in January 2010, didn't enter service until December 2020, a full 10 years after it first took to the skies. And when it did, several aviation experts noted that it's far from the stealth fighter Russia claims it to be. One of those experts, Chris Bolton, took to social media to point out that the jet has a radar cross-section similar to the FA-18 Super Hornet. That's notable because the Super Hornet isn't a stealth fighter. The F-35 is, and the Su-57 has a radar cross-section 1,000 times bigger than America's main stealth fighter. That poor cross-section is a major problem. After all, a stealth fighter that shows up so prominently on radar isn't a stealth fighter at all. Perhaps that's why the Kremlin hasn't deployed it over the skies of Ukraine. It knows that there's a good chance that one of its 10 Su-57s will get shot down, leaving it with egg on its face, as it tries to explain why a stealth fighter it claims is veering into the 6th generation of jets was so easily taken down by a country that shouldn't be prepared for it. So we see the problem of Russia relying on old Soviet-era tech again in the war against Ukraine. Only the Su-57 adds another issue. Even Russia's newest technology appears to be incapable of operating at the expected capacity. Hence, Russia doesn't dominate the skies over Ukraine. But what about the seas? In pure numbers, Russia has the world's largest navy, with nearly 750 assets. It should have been able to bring that navy to bear against Ukraine via the Black Sea, with its dreaded Black Sea Fleet, anticipated to help Russia claim the only waters that lead into Ukraine. But again, that didn't happen. Instead, Ukraine's navy, which is around a seventh of Russia's size, has somehow managed to decimate the Black Sea Fleet. According to The Guardian, it had destroyed a third of the fleet by March 2024, with one of its latest strikes taking out the Kostiantin-Olshansky, an amphibious landing ship that was stationed in Russian-controlled Sevastopol. In fact, all Russia's navy has managed was an amphibious incursion into Odessa during the early weeks of the war. Since then, Ukraine has managed to defend against the Black Sea Fleet by using coastal attacks to pepper Putin's surface ships with missiles and munitions. Warrior Maven points out that a problem that has already been highlighted in other Russian weapons affects its navy, an over-reliance on old Soviet technology. For instance, the Admiral Nakhimov, a Russian battlecruiser, is still armed with firepower developed during the 1980s. It has no hypersonic missiles, and despite being almost as large as an Iowa-class battlecruiser, it packs far less firepower than comparable ships. The US Naval Institute, or USNI, digs deeper. It points out that the Russian Navy underwent an extensive period of modernization, beginning in the aftermath of the 2008 war between Russia and Georgia. In the 14 years since the end of that war and the beginning of the one in Ukraine, Russia should have had plenty of time to produce new surface combatants and submarines, as well as upgrade the capabilities of its existing fleet. The investment was provided, yet the Russian Navy, though growing in size, is still far behind where any would anticipate it to be. Part of the reason, according to the USNI, lies in Russia's approach to its navy. Historically, the country has always focused its ships on continental security concerns, perhaps leaving them ill-equipped to deal with something like a waterborne invasion of Ukraine. But more worrying for Russia are the periods of neglect that the Navy has been through. For instance, the collapse of the Soviet Union saw Russia reduce its navy by 75%, placing it in a position where it needed to catch up once Russia reached a point where it needed ships again. We see that in the aftermath of the war with Georgia. Russia had to invest heavily to bring its navy anywhere near being close to par. Even then, the USNI points out that Russia's modernized navy isn't much different from its Soviet-era navy. Strategy still revolves around land-based active defense, resulting in the construction of ships that are perhaps less capable of attacking positions on land. Again, the Ukraine war provides an example of this, with the USNI saying that Russia is seemingly incapable of providing direct naval support to its army's flank from the water. That's surprising, given how well Russia used that very tactic throughout World War II. It all adds up to a navy that, though impressive on paper, is far less capable than it appears. Still, where you could be justified in thinking that Russia's naval failings are as much due to strategy as weaponry, even if it's still relying on Soviet ships and tech, there's no excuse for the body armor issues the country experiences. Those issues were evident from the beginning of the war. In May 2022, Newsweek reported on a call intercepted by the security service of Ukraine that supposedly saw a Russian soldier speaking to his mother on the phone about the state of his body armor. The mother asks the soldier what he needs. The soldier's reply, "Body armor. It's just what we have now is terrible." But that's nothing compared to an October 2022 report published in Forbes. It points out that 2017 saw Russia announce that it was to receive 200,000 sets of its advanced Ratnik II body armor suits, with deliveries up to 2020 leaving it with 300,000 sets. Similar to Western body armor, the Ratnik II features aramid soft armor, which is supposed to protect against shrapnel and low-velocity bullets, as well as ceramic plate inserts to guard against rifle rounds. That armor hadn't found its way onto the Ukrainian battlefield by October 2022. Instead, Forbes claims, Russian troops were being issued body armor that was either inadequate or in some cases fake. There are reports of a replica of Russia's standard body armor designed for airsoft and paintball purposes being delivered to soldiers. That armor wasn't armor at all. It had no bullet resistance. In this case, it's possible that corruption lies at the heart of Russia's failings rather than inadequacy. For instance, 2021 saw a Russian captain get convicted for stealing and selling 56 body armor sets on Avito, Russia's equivalent to eBay, which raises the question of how many other sets have simply gone missing. Forbes also suggests that some new Russian recruits are being forced to buy their own body armor rather than it being supplied as standard. So Russia appears to have a twofold problem in this area. Not only is it issuing fake body armor to its soldiers, it appears to be running so low in its supply of real body armor that it's forcing conscripts to buy what they need. Still, if all else fails, at least Russia has its nuclear weapons, right? Putin has claimed several times since the beginning of the Ukraine war that he's considering using tactical nukes in the fight. Plus, he's made several threats to NATO and its members about the possibility of nuclear war if they get directly involved. But even Russia's nuclear threat may not be as strong as it's perceived. As Wired points out, nobody really knows if the decades-old nukes that make up much of Russia's arsenal still work anymore. After all, nuclear weapons require maintenance. The components inside them have expiration dates. They're subject to oxidation, decay, and metal fatigue. There's also the tritium problem. This essential isotope is used in hydrogen bombs and has a half-life of 12.3 years. Even if Russia has stockpiles of this isotope, which sells for $34,000 per gram, those stockpiles are subject to that same level of decay. Given what we've seen already, with Russia falling back onto so much of its old Soviet tech to make up for its modern weapons either performing poorly or not at all in Ukraine, can anybody guarantee that it's been maintaining its nuclear weapons? Or is it sitting on a decaying stockpile of nukes, many of which would deliver little more than a fizzle if they were launched? But we can only speculate. What is clear is that corruption, a focus on developing prestige weapons such as the Su-57 that don't appear to work, and a reliance on old technology are the main reasons why Russia's weapons are so bad. The Ukraine war has simply exposed how bad and perhaps serves as a practical demonstration of why so many countries that used to buy billions in Russian weapons exports are now looking elsewhere. But what do you think? Are Russia's weapons really as bad as they appear, or is the country's struggle to take Ukraine down to tactical factors? Will Russia still win the war, even if it's relying on outdated weapons? Tell us what you think in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out why all Russian weapons are a failure, or click this other video instead. February 24, 2022. Russia invades Ukraine in what was designed as a smash-and-grab military mission. The objective was simple: catch the Ukrainians by surprise, overwhelm the country's forces, and take Kyiv. In doing so, Russia would control the rest of Ukraine, depriving it of the independence it had held since the breakdown of the Soviet Union in the process. And it almost worked. President Vladimir Putin's troops got as far as the outskirts of Kyiv before Ukraine managed to organize its defenses and fight back. Support from the international community started flooding in, bolstering Ukraine's forces and giving them access to the equipment and munitions they needed to repel the Russian invasion and even launch counterattacks. But it shouldn't have been enough. Even with all of the support flowing into Ukraine, Russia's military is supposed to be strong enough to defeat a nation that is a fraction of its size and strength. So why hasn't it? Why is Russia's army so weak when for years it's been touted as one of the world's strongest militaries? After all, the statistics paint a picture of a country that could bulldoze almost any other on the planet. According to Global Firepower, or GFP, which ranks countries annually based on the strength of their militaries, Russia is the second strongest in the world. It only just falls behind the United States and is ahead of China, with a military so massive that it should be the envy of most other countries. Just take a look at the numbers. When it comes to sheer firepower, Russia has 1.32 million active military personnel, with a further 2 million sitting in reserve. That's not to mention paramilitary forces, such as the infamous Wagner Group, which is 250,000 members strong. Throw in conscription, which the country has started to enforce since the beginning of the Ukraine war, and Russia has access to a further 46.4 million people outside of its active military that it could push into service. On the surface, it also has the second strongest air force in the world. GFP says it has 4,255 aircraft in stock, with 2,766 of those being in a state of combat readiness. Again, the only country that beats Russia's air force is the United States, at least in sheer numbers, and yet we've seen Russia fail to take advantage of its aerial superiority time and time again in Ukraine. More on that later. For now, let's focus on Russia on the ground. Again, the numbers show its supposed might. A staggering 14,777 tanks, the most in the world, and 161,382 vehicles are in the Russian armory. It has the most towed and self-propelled artillery in the world, as well as a huge stock of 3,065 multiple-launch rocket systems. Then there's its navy. On paper, it's the largest in the world, with 781 assets. It has the most submarines, 65, and the most corvettes at 83. Russia is also heavily adept at mine warfare, with 47 vessels. Frankly, Ukraine shouldn't have stood a chance. If Russia's military is as strong as it appears on paper, its ground troops should have steamrolled through Ukraine, supported by an air force that would make it incredibly difficult for Ukraine's ground forces to fight back. Russia's navy should also have held the Black Sea, allowing the country to send more troops into Ukraine, while also buffeting its coastlines with attacks. But none of this happened. Instead, we've seen Russia get bogged down in a war that's lasted for over 2 years at the time of this video's creation. Its Black Sea fleet was roundly defeated, its air force has failed to establish aerial dominance over Ukraine, and even its ground troops, though they've slowly managed to gain ground in the country, have suffered massive losses that some sources estimate to be veering close to 500,000 people. In short, we've seen Russia exposed as a paper tiger, a military that looks dominating on paper but is revealed to be much weaker when at actual war. All of which leads us to the key question we'll answer in this video: why is Russia so weak? There are many reasons behind Russia's strength deception, starting with the corruption that runs rampant through not only its military, but also in the general Russian leadership structure. In a March 2022 article examining Russia's failure to take Ukraine quickly, Politico highlighted the effects of corruption on Russian troops. It cited reports that some of the country's soldiers had received rations that expired in 2015, noting that there's a connection between Yevgeny Prigozhin, the late main patron of the Wagner military group killed in a mysterious jet crash in 2023, and many of the companies that make these rations. The implication was that Prigozhin was taking the money he got from Russia's government and using it to line his own pockets. Former Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny practically said as much when campaigning against Putin, claiming that Prigozhin's companies essentially operated a cartel that gamed the Russian bidding system to land huge contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Very little of that money would go towards supplying the food and equipment Russia's troops needed. As for Navalny, he was imprisoned in 2021 on charges of embezzlement. Around 18 months later, he went missing from his cell for 3 weeks, only to be found in another prison located in the Arctic Circle. By February 2024, he was dead. Russia is accused by many Western governments of having killed him. Politico's article goes on to report that Russia's troops involved in the initial invasion of Ukraine were held back by a lack of fuel they needed to push forward. Again, corruption was likely the cause of this problem. Russia is one of the most fuel-rich countries in the world. Even with the many sanctions placed against it by Western countries in the wake of the Ukraine war, it's still the world's third-largest oil producer. And yet, it couldn't keep its own troops stocked up with the fuel they needed to complete their mission. Embezzlement may have been the issue here as well. Russia's military often refers to fuel as its second currency, indicating long-standing knowledge that the fuel that's supposed to go to the military is often siphoned away to line other people's pockets. These are just a couple of examples. And it gets worse for Russia on the corruption front. In a 2020 report, Transparency International and its Government Defense Integrity Index placed Russia in Band D. That indicates a high risk of corruption, owing to a lack of external oversight on budgets, policies, and the activities of the institutions the country relies upon to provide for its military. It's a real-life example of the idiom, "when the cat's away, the mice will play." Only in this case, the Russian state cat turning a blind eye to the many mice in its military system allows those mice to severely undermine the strength of the country's military. Kickbacks and theft are commonplace according to Action on Armed Violence, with Russia's military reflecting its social hierarchy: rigid, brutal, corrupt. A trio of issues leads to those at the top getting richer, while constantly having to watch their backs, while those on the ground in Ukraine have to deal with situations that shouldn't affect any modern military. But corruption is far from Russia's only military problem. There's also the fact that the invasion of Ukraine wasn't even a military decision, it came from the Kremlin. To understand why that matters, you need to know what the Kremlin is. Though the term Kremlin is often interchangeably used with military when it comes to Russia, the two are separate. The Kremlin is actually Russia's government, and it was this group that planned and launched the operation in Ukraine, not the military. That creates problems of its own. Like in the military hierarchy, those in the Kremlin are both subject to corruption and fearful of the possibility that they may lose their position. The latter issue was especially important to what we see in Ukraine, according to GIS. The research organization suggests that Putin's Kremlin advisors were likely too scared to inform their masters of the true state of Russia's military, leading to Putin heading to Ukraine with a misinformed view of his military's true might. It's because of this lack of communication within the Kremlin that we've also seen so many Russian logistical failures inside Ukraine. GIS highlights one instance that it says is symbolic of Russia's logistical failings. Near the beginning of the war, a column of soldiers from the Rosgvardia, the Kremlin's National Guard unit, were sent toward Ukraine in lightly armored vehicles. Those soldiers weren't equipped with guns or similar military apparel. Instead, they went in more as riot police than soldiers, being given shields, batons, and helmets. Their objective was to control the streets of Kyiv. The reality was that they were essentially lambs to the slaughter for the city's defenders, showcasing the Kremlin's complete lack of understanding of what its military actually needed to take the city. This singular instance of poor planning is symptomatic of what's happened throughout the 2 years that Russia has been fighting Ukraine. Rand expands on this, pointing out that the Kremlin utterly failed to anticipate the invasion's logistical requirements, going as far as to suggest the Kremlin may not have even had the capacity to understand this requirement. It points out that Russian troops rapidly ran out of equipment and ammo in the early months of the war, making it impossible to either seize territory or maintain control over territory they had already taken. And the situation isn't getting much better. In a November 2023 report published in Pravda, the news outlet reported on the UK's Ministry of Defence, or MOD, and it claims that Russian military personnel on the front lines in Ukraine face terrible living conditions. Supposedly, soldiers who had returned from the front lines had been wet from head to toe for several weeks and were even unable to light fires in their camps. After all, doing so could alert Ukrainian forces to their positions, meaning they were forced into eating monotonous and perhaps outdated rations in the mud while they waited for orders. It all adds up to Russia failing to provide its soldiers with what they need. Corruption is part of the reason for that. The equipment just doesn't exist in some places. But the Kremlin's failure to plan its special military operation properly, seemingly just operating under the assumption that Russia would achieve an easy win, led to a poor logistical setup. In other words, even the equipment that Russia can provide to its soldiers on the front lines either isn't getting to them or isn't usable once it's there. Let's take a deeper look at the equipment. Russia has increasingly relied on old Soviet stock to attack Ukraine. According to European Security and Defense, or ES&D, Russia's initial February 2022 invasion saw its best-trained soldiers going in with the most modern equipment the country could provide. It was the Ukrainians who were forced to rely on outdated Soviet-era technology, at least until the support started pouring in from the global community. By the summer of 2022, the situation was starting to reverse. That's when the first losses of the demothballed tanks that were previously left to rot in storage before being used in the war, were recorded. We've seen Russia using T-62s in Ukraine, as well as T-54 and 55 tanks, some of which may have been built as far back as 1946 in its attacks. ES&D also points out that Russia has pulled about 40% of its Soviet-era tanks and armored vehicles out of its Baratia base for use in Ukraine. Russia has reasons for using this old equipment. They were deployed to provide non-precise artillery fire to support ground troops, which is itself indicative of the fact that Russia had lost a lot of its tube artillery. Those older tanks were also kept in territory that Russia already occupied, allowing them to strengthen the country's defenses in anticipation of Ukrainian counterattacks. Some of the T-54s and T-55s were even used as kamikaze vehicles, being loaded with explosives before they were sent to Ukrainian positions. Still, the fact they're being used at all suggests Russia is running out of more modern equipment. Take the Sosna-U thermal imaging systems that were built into the country's T-72 tanks at the start of the war. Those are becoming less and less common as the war goes on, with the T-72s that Ukraine captures showing that Russia has started using older and cheaper systems. Switch focus to armored personnel carriers, and we start to see howitzers that date back to the 1940s being deployed, as well as naval guns from the 1950s being mounted on some vehicles. All of this outdated equipment can be effective, but it also shows that Russia's military failed to modernize to the extent it needed to handle a full-scale war. If it had, Russia wouldn't be using the Soviet-era weaponry at all. It would have better tanks, artillery, and armored vehicles that were more than capable of defeating most of what Ukraine had to offer. So we're starting to see a confluence of issues leading to the weakened state of Russia's military. Endemic corruption, both in the military structure and the Kremlin, is exacerbated by terrible military planning leading into the war. Add to that a surprising lack of modern equipment. Perhaps corruption played a role there as well, and it can feel like we're seeing a version of Russia from the late 1980s fighting in 2024. Let's bring things down to the troop level. We've already touched on how Russia's poor logistics and planning are forcing its soldiers to endure terrible conditions on the front lines. However, we haven't talked about Russia's strategy of sending wave after wave of untrained or drafted soldiers to the front lines. In many respects, it appears to be employing a cannon fodder strategy in which it tries to overwhelm Ukraine with masses of poorly trained soldiers. There's plenty of evidence for this. In September 2022, Forbes published an article in which it claimed that Russia's practice of drafting untrained soldiers was equivalent to the Kremlin committing premeditated murder against its own people. That report built on another earlier in the month that suggested Russia was about to draft 300,000 soldiers, none of whom it would be able to train properly. Putin's announcement of that draft came with the caveat that only those who've previously served in the armed forces and have particular military specializations would be drafted, with the goal being to boost active forces up to 1.4 million. That announcement met with protests in Russia, which were exacerbated when the Kremlin ordered that Russian airlines could no longer sell tickets to any man between the ages of 18 and 60. While problematic in its own right, that ruling alone shows that Putin wants all able-bodied Russian men to be available to him. More worrying for those draftees is the lack of any real training. According to Forbes, Russia's initial training for soldiers is cursory by design, with most of the training intended to happen on the front lines with experienced soldiers showing recruits the ropes once they arrive. That's a shaky system at the best of times because it splits the focus of frontline troops. But in a war like Russia faces in Ukraine, it can have a devastating effect. Not only are the troops on the front line already struggling with a lack of supplies and equipment, but many of them can't exactly be considered veterans themselves. A new draftee may end up being trained by someone who only has a few months more experience. When the training works, it's because the recruits work alongside a brigade's 3rd Battalion, which is often reserved for training, while the brigade's other battalions are fighting. But in Ukraine, those 3rd battalions are all fighting as well, meaning there are very few soldiers left over to help the draftees. The result is an inconsistent training system that's entirely reliant on the quality and positioning of the unit to which a draftee is dispatched. A brigade that has no veterans and limited equipment, as is possible given Russia's logistical and corruption issues, isn't going to be able to properly train a draftee. That brings us back to the Forbes article suggesting that this approach is tantamount to murder. It cites the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, when it says that mobilized men with a day or two of training are unlikely to meaningfully reinforce Russian positions. As for the training those new soldiers receive on the front line, it's often non-existent, as the ISW discovered when speaking to a then recent draftee to Russia's 1st Tank Regiment. That draftee claimed that he'd received no new training in the days since he'd arrived at the Kherson Oblast in Ukraine. He was operating based on the 1 or 2 days of training he'd received before he deployed. It gets worse. If new draftees are essentially cannon fodder due to their lack of training, some Russian soldiers are literally treated as such. That's according to a February 2024 article in the Kyiv Post, which quotes a Russian soldier from the 5th Separatist Motorized Rifle Brigade as claiming that many in his unit are being thrown onto the front lines, not because of their value as soldiers, but because they're ill. He says many who are on frontline duty in Ukraine's southern military district are seriously ill, with many having tuberculosis and some, including himself, being HIV positive. So here are 16 people who have hepatitis, suspected tuberculosis, lung disease, tumors in their heads, he says when describing the soldiers he's working alongside. That's hardly indicative of a well-oiled fighting force. Untrained draftees, many of whom are ill, are essentially being used to soak up Ukrainian bullets and artillery, and therein lies another reason why Russia's military is so weak. The Kremlin doesn't appear to care about its people. In its desperate grab for the material power that would come with claiming Ukraine, Russia appears to have started ignoring the human cost. Many of the country's soldiers are fighting on foot without real support, with Utah State University saying the approach shows that the Kremlin's tolerance for human casualties is only growing higher. In other words, losing tens, perhaps even hundreds of thousands of people in the war doesn't matter because Russia can always replace those people with more warm bodies. Of course, the inevitable happens when there's such callousness on display from leadership. Morale tanks. The Washington Post argued in March 2022 that a large proportion of the early troops sent into Ukraine simply didn't want to be there. That's supported by the number of Russians who've left their homeland since the war began. That number could be as high as 800,000. The early days of the war also saw many videos cropping up on social media of Russian soldiers leaving their tanks, begging for food, and even looting. Footage of captured soldiers would also sometimes show their confusion over why they were in Ukraine in the first place. Contrast that to Ukraine's ground troops. Though far inferior in numbers, every Ukrainian is fighting to protect and preserve their country. Morale may dip at times, especially when Russia makes advances, but motivation is never a question. Russia is trying to break Ukraine's spirit with an army filled with soldiers who may not even want to be there in the first place. Tack everything we've talked about so far – poor training, bad logistics, corruption, old equipment, and the Kremlin's apparent willingness to sacrifice soldiers to gain ground, and you have a recipe for a morale crisis. Those morale issues are only made worse by the disunity in Russian command. We touched on this earlier when highlighting how the Kremlin launched its Ukraine invasion seemingly without paying any heed to the true state of Russia's military. The Foreign Policy Research Institute, or FPRI, digs deeper with a March 2023 report that claims Russia's subpar performance in Ukraine is a result of the country's failure to decentralize military decision-making. Every decision has to come from Putin or the small collection of his trusted advisors, with those in the middle levels of Russia's military unable to make decisions for themselves. This centralized approach also creates communication problems throughout Russia's entire military structure. Either important information gets distorted as it passes up or down a long chain of command, or it simply doesn't get communicated at all, as may have been the case when the Kremlin was making its invasion decision. The FPIR claims that this centralization in decision-making is the result of a society that has rarely ever been overseen by a government to which its population wholly consents. Autocracy reigns supreme in Russia. Putin's long tenure as the country's president demonstrates that, with the Russian autocrat rarely facing legal restraints or any control mechanisms that could influence decision-making. How does that manifest into Russian military weakness? A Russian non-commissioned officer, or NCO, barely wields any power. They are trained not to show any initiative or to make decisions on behalf of the soldiers that serve underneath them, instead acting as little more than intermediaries between the Russian hierarchy and the soldiers on the front lines. That approach is dangerous enough when you consider that all orders come from a government that may not be fully aware of what's happening on the front lines in Ukraine. But it becomes practically foolish when you consider that people on those front lines have practically no way of telling the Kremlin what's happening. Adjustments become more difficult to make. Tactics and strategies can't be tweaked to react to the situation on the ground. Russian soldiers are basically pointed in a direction and told to go, without any consideration given by the country's hierarchy as to the situation those soldiers face. In other words, information doesn't flow freely. And given that information is one of the most important assets that any military can have, that's a massive problem for Russia's military. It's also a problem that likely contributes to the country's seeming lack of tactical and strategic nous. Again, we've touched on this already when speaking about the terrible planning that went into Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But it's perhaps most obvious in the way that Russia's Air Force, the VVS, has almost completely failed to establish aerial superiority over Ukraine. That should have been an easy task. As we mentioned earlier, Russia has thousands of aerial assets, with Ukraine only having around 320, with only 177 of those craft being in a state of combat readiness. Worse yet for Ukraine, most of its planes were Soviet-era designs, meaning Russia's more modern planes should have easily taken the skies above the country. That didn't happen. In an interview with the United States Air Force Lieutenant General Scott Kinsvater, Cambridge Economic Policy Associates, or CEPA, announced that the US considers Russia's aerial performance to be very poor. Kinsvater cited a complete lack of planning capacity, as well as Russia seeming to have no ability to coordinate aerial assaults with the rest of its armed forces, as a key reason for that rating. Combined with the misuse of equipment, which may stem from bad training for Russia's pilots, and you get a VVS that has failed to learn lessons dating back to the Second World War. Kinsvater says that war marked the first time that countries started using their aerial assets to support soldiers on the ground, yet Russia doesn't seem to have done that. In his words, the benefits were so great that they effectively resulted in 1 + 1 = 6, and he cites endemic corruption as being the possible reason why Russia hasn't evolved to use aerial tactics that the United States has used for decades. He also suggests that communication is an issue in two ways. The obvious one is the lack of communication between ground and aerial forces, making it impossible to run operations in tandem. However, Kinsvater also suggests that the flow of information within Russia's military has been hampered by those in command, not wanting to reveal how poor the VVS had become in the wake of years of investment made into new aircraft. It all feeds back into this idea that Russia is little more than a paper tiger. Russia has been responding to these sentiments in peculiar ways. As Ian Williams, a research fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, points out, we're seeing Russia being a little more aggressive and greater risk-taking right now because they are trying to offset this perception that they're kind of this paper tiger. That's in reference to several incidents in which US Air Force drones had unsafe encounters with Russian jets in July 2023. One of those encounters resulted in a Russian pilot positioning themselves in front of an American drone before engaging their jet's afterburners. Those encounters are somewhat provocative, though no fighting will result from them. They're really examples of Russia trying to prove it's stronger than the rest of the world seems to believe. And therein lies the problem for Putin. His war in Ukraine has exposed that Russia's military is far weaker than it looks on paper. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to lose the war. Even a weaker than expected Russia is still fairly strong, as demonstrated by the country's recent, small yet significant gains in the Kharkiv region. But Russia isn't the juggernaut that people believed it to be. If it was, it would have steamrolled Ukraine long before any international intervention could have prolonged the war in the country to the point where it's been going for over 2 years. Now Russia appears to be in a position where it's trying to save face while asserting dominance, all while the world's other militaries continue to gain insight into what the Russian war machine is really like. But what do you think about the Russian military? Is it truly a paper tiger that could be defeated if it took on a country with a stronger military than Ukraine? Or are we seeing a Russia that's actually holding back, with its true strength likely only to be revealed if it faced a larger threat? Tell us what you think in the comments section, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out why Russia's Navy is in serious trouble, or click this other video instead. Imagine a high-stakes showdown where the underdog takes on a giant. That's the scene as the Ukraine conflict unfolds, a real-world test of Russia's newest and supposedly most formidable weapons. Experts once feared these advanced armaments would be Ukraine's undoing, expecting them to easily overpower the lesser-equipped Ukrainian forces. But here's where the plot twists. Ukraine isn't the same player it was back in 2014 and 15. It's leveled up thanks to Western weapons and military training, shaking off its old Soviet-era playbook. Meanwhile, Russia's showcase of high-tech weaponry turns out it's even more smoke and mirrors than fire and fury, with many of these new tools either underperforming or not showing up at all. This begs the question, were the skeptics right all along about Russia's overhyped military machine? And when it comes down to it, how does Russia's best gear measure up against the powerhouse arsenal of the United States? Get ready as our military experts dive into the heart of this modern David versus Goliath story. The Russian military has suffered many embarrassments in Ukraine, but the biggest humiliation is the decimation of its tank force. As of the end of February 2024, Russia has lost a visually confirmed 2,758 tanks. Curiously, or not so curiously, the T-14 Armata is not one of them. No T-14 has ever been sent to Ukraine. In contrast, Ukraine has now begun to field the 31 M1A1 Abrams tanks the United States has given it. Although the possibility of the Armata and the Abrams encountering each other on the Ukrainian battlefield seems low, the presence of the American tank raises an interesting question about what would happen if the two tanks did collide. The M1 Abrams has been in service since 1980. The most modern version, the M1A2, has a top speed of 42 miles per hour and a range of 256 miles. Its main weapon is a 120mm XM256 smoothbore gun. The secondary weapons are an M2 Browning 50 caliber machine gun and an M240 7.62mm coaxial machine gun. The main gun can fire a plethora of rounds, including the M829 APF SDST, armor-piercing fin-stabilized discarding sabot, and the M830 Heat MPT, high-explosive anti-tank multi-purpose tracer. The latest and greatest Abrams tank, the M1A2 SEPV3, also fires a new round which can destroy fortifications like bunkers or be set to burst in the air to take out enemy anti-tank guided missile teams 2 kilometers away. The Abrams main gun has a range of about 2.5 miles depending on the round. The Abrams tank has some of the best armor in the world. It's protected with explosive reactive armor that's designed to counteract shaped charges on anti-tank missiles, as well as a layer of depleted uranium. In 2023, the Army began outfitting Abrams tanks with an active protection system called Trophy. This system includes radar antennas that detect incoming anti-tank rockets or missiles. Once detected, Trophy launches interceptors. Fielding it has proven to be a challenge, however. The Abrams also has the benefit of protecting its crew by keeping the ammunition magazine separate from their compartment. M250 grenade launchers can fire smoke grenades to conceal the tank from incoming fire, adding another layer of protection. The Abrams' weight has increased over the years. It began with a weight of 60 tons, but the latest version weighs 73.6 tons because of various improvements added to the tank in the form of its depleted uranium armor, 120mm gun, remote-controlled machine guns, and more. The weight has become concerning enough that the Pentagon has started to worry about it. Defense Department officials fear that the increased weight makes the Abrams difficult to transport to the battlefield and recover if it's damaged. The T-14 Armata, meanwhile, should be a significant improvement over Russia's traditional tanks. Unlike them, it has a protective crew capsule that separates the crew from the magazine, limiting the potential for the catastrophic explosions that have been common in Ukraine. The Armata's armor is a composite modular system made of steel, ceramics, and other materials. The forward part of the tank is covered with explosive reactive armor to defend against anti-tank weapons. The tank's rear comes with bar armor to better protect it against low-level anti-tank weapons like RPGs. The Armata also has an active protection system that defends against incoming anti-tank weapons and has smoke grenade launchers. Additional active and passive armor can be attached to the tank. The tank's silhouetted low design also provides an added measure of protection. The tank weighs about 55 tons thanks to its supposedly more efficient armor. Its engineers supposedly relied on active and passive protection systems to save weight. The T-14's main weapon is a 125mm 2A821M smoothbore gun. In addition to the traditional rounds, the T-14 can also supposedly fire reflex anti-tank missiles from its main gun to a range of 3.1 miles. A new weapon, the 3U-BK-21 Sprinter anti-tank missile with a range of 7 miles, was also planned for the Armata, although it had not yet entered service as of 2021. The secondary armaments are the 12.7mm Cord machine gun and a 7.62mm Pencheng PKP or a PKTM machine gun. A second 7.62mm machine gun is mounted on a remote weapon station on the top rear of the turret. The tank has a top speed of between 50 and 55 miles per hour and a range of about 310 miles. On paper, these are all formidable attributes, and indeed, before the war in Ukraine, many Western security experts feared that the T-14 Armata would prove superior to any of the tanks in NATO's arsenal. But there is a problem: Russia can't field it. To date, Russia has only built about 20 prototypes. Serial production was supposed to begin in 2021, but it's now 3 years later and that still hasn't happened. Because of the problems with the T-14's unconventional engine, the A85-3, the obstacles to serial production remain significant. But what would happen if the Armata and the Abrams actually came to blows? The Armata's ability to fire anti-tank missiles make it a formidable threat if the system works as advertised. However, this is where the Abrams' heavy frame can give it an advantage. Although the Armata's armor may have efficiency improvements, there is nothing yet capable of substituting the heavy armor the Abrams carries, which should make it more survivable in a confrontation between the two. On paper, the Armata's features seem more impressive overall, especially with its added range, but until the newest Russian tank can actually arrive on the battlefield and demonstrate its attributes reliably, we will not know the answer. The war in Ukraine has given us reason to doubt Russia's paper claims, and the Kremlin's refusal to deploy the Armata in combat suggests that it isn't as confident about its newest tank as it seemed on the parade grounds. In the skies, Russia's best plane is the 5th-generation Su-57 Felon. This plane was designed to be an answer to the F-22 Raptor. But how does it compare to the Raptor and the other 5th-generation plane in the American Air Fleet, the F-35 Lightning II? The Su-57 Felon is powered by two Saturn AL-41F1 turbofan engines that generate 35,000 pounds of force. It can reach supersonic speeds without relying on its afterburners, can climb at a rate of 64,000 feet per minute, and has a service ceiling of about 66,000 feet. Aviation experts think it has a range of 750 miles. Some of the Su-57's best features are its 7,500 kilogram payload capacity, with 10 internal and 6 external holders for missiles and bombs, and its 3D thrust vectoring engines, which make it formidable in dogfights. There are some other clever features built into the Su-57. One of them is a laser defense turret capable of blinding incoming infrared-guided missiles that makes it particularly effective while defending against short-range munitions like the AIM-9 Sidewinder. The Su-57 does have a major weakness, however: its relative lack of stealth. Some experts do not even consider it a true stealth aircraft. Most of its stealthy features are concentrated at the front, while the flanks and rear are vulnerable. Although the Felon is a big improvement compared to Russia's previous aircraft, with a radar cross-section of supposedly 0.1 square meters, it can reportedly be detected up to a range of 35 miles, which still falls far short of American standards. The F-22 Raptor, by contrast, is supposedly detectable only at a range of 10 miles. Meanwhile, the Su-57's other competitor, the F-35, has the cross-section of a metal golf ball and is only detectable at even closer range. The F-35 has a top speed of Mach 1.6, a service ceiling of 50,000 feet, and a climb rate of 45,000 feet per minute. The F-22, meanwhile, has a top speed of Mach 2.25 and can reach supersonic velocity without using its afterburners. It has a climb rate of 62,000 feet per minute and a service ceiling of about 60,000 feet. Like the Su-57, its twin Pratt & Whitney F119 PW100 engines are capable of thrust vectoring. Two things matter the most to modern air battles: range and stealth. The plane that can shoot down its target from beyond visual range before being detected will have an overwhelming advantage in an aerial confrontation. These are precisely the areas where the F-35 excels, and it will excel further once it gets its new radar, the AN/APG-85. The F-22, with its AN/APG-77 radar, also has a high situational awareness, with a 360-degree view and TR modules which enable 270-degree coverage around the Raptor. The Su-57 has an advanced AESA radar of its own, the N036 Bielka. This radar's X and L band capabilities allow for improved situational awareness and electronic warfare measures and countermeasures. The radar can reportedly detect targets of 11 square feet from 250 miles away. and it's spread across the Su-57's body to increase the plane's situational awareness. However, this radar is unlikely to match the F-35's flying supercomputer attributes. The current AN/APG-81 radar on the F-35 likely has at least 50 miles on it, and the new radar will have an even greater range once it's installed. One-on-one, the F-35 will likely be able to detect and shoot down the Su-57 first, especially once it gets its AIM-260 JATM. The F-22 will be able to do the same. The F-22 and F-35 working in concert make for an even more formidable pair, as the F-35's sensor fusion abilities make the F-22 better able to complete its missions. The F-22 will be well conditioned to detect and shoot down the Su-57 from long range, especially with the added help. In a dogfight, the Su-57 would have a significant advantage over the F-35 thanks to its superior speed, maneuverability, ceiling, and climbing rate. The F-35 was not a plane built for such close combat. The F-22, on the other hand, was. In a dogfight, much would depend on the training of the two pilots, although in this area the default advantage likely goes to the American pilot. American pilots get over 200 hours of flight time per year, while their Russian counterparts get between 130 and 180. With this in mind, we can look at the design differences between the two planes. Both emphasize maneuverability, but the Su-57 also emphasizes speed. One aviation expert, Piotr Batowski, has claimed that the Russian plane has much more maneuverability at supersonic speeds than any previous fighter. The Su-57's infrared search and track systems also provides a significant advantage. The Su-57 can also carry more weapons than the F-22, with 12 hardpoints against the latter's 8. However, the F-22 has a higher turn rate than the Su-57. Although it has 2D rather than 3D thrust vectoring, its nozzles give it the power to turn more narrowly, which is the most important factor in a dogfight. So while the F-22 would prefer to stay at long range and shoot the Su-57 down before the Russian plane can detect it, it can more than hold its own in a dogfight, even though the odds for the Russian plane would be far more even at that range. The battle for supremacy in the skies did not take place solely in that domain, however. Ground-based air defense systems play critical roles. The United States and Russia both have a series of sophisticated air defense systems. Two of the more famous ones are the American Patriot and the Russian S-400. The Patriot had its beginnings in the 1960s and entered service in the early 1980s. It still serves as the US Army's main defense against incoming ballistic missiles, with additional upgrades to its missile and radar systems making it adaptable to a changing battle environment. In 2023, the Patriot made headlines by shooting down one of Russia's hypersonic Kinzhal missiles targeting Kyiv, revealing its staying power as a defense system. A Patriot battery consists of a command post, 8 launchers and support vehicles. One battery can support up to 16 launchers if need be. To establish a strong defensive network, batteries are located between 18 and 25 miles from each other. 4 missiles are typically carried per container. The current Patriot uses 2 types of missiles, the PAC-2 and the PAC-3. The PAC-2 had its origins in the 1990s and improved on the original PAC-1 missile that had shown a few shortcomings in the Gulf War. The PAC-2 missile follows the Patriot battery's AN/MPQ-53 phased array radar system to carefully track its target. Once guided near the target, the PAC-2 passively tracks it and then detonates. The PAC-2 has a range of about 100 miles and a maximum altitude of 15.5. The PAC-3 is a smaller missile and weighs only 2/3 as much as the PAC-2. Because of its compact size, a single Patriot launcher can carry 16 of them rather than 4. The PAC-3 is not designed to detonate at a distance away from an incoming projectile, but rather impact it directly. The PAC-3 therefore has a set of 180 solid-fueled altitude-controlled monitors in its forward section to give it better maneuverability in flight. It also has a Ka-band radar seeker to guide it toward its target in the final phases. Because of its lighter weight and superior propulsion system, the PAC-3 can defend an area 7 times greater than the PAC-2. The Patriot's radars currently do not have 360-degree coverage, but a new radar in development called the Lower Tier Air and Missile Defense System will give it this upgrade. The new system will be an AESA radar with gallium nitride power amplifiers. Such amplifiers will improve the Patriot's resistance to enemy electronic warfare attacks and provide greater situational awareness. Testing of the system began in May 2022, and the initial delivery of the new radar system was slated for December 2023, but the Army was having some difficulties that made experts doubt whether that date would be met. Contrasting with the Patriot is Russia's S-400 Triumph. The system saw its genesis in the 1990s and became operational in 2007. The S-400 uses 3 different types of missiles. The first is the 48N6, which has a range of about 155 miles and can intercept incoming ballistic missiles at a radius of about 40. The second is the 77N6, which directly impacts its target like the PAC-3. These missiles are specifically designed to destroy the warhead of an incoming ballistic missile. In a nuclear scenario, this would limit radioactive fallout by avoiding a detonation. Finally, there is the 40N6. This is a longer-range missile that can extend outward to about 250 miles, although its deployment status is unclear according to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. There are also doubts as to whether the S-400's radar system is capable of making use of the 40N6's range. The S-400 has been a popular export item. China and India have both purchased it. Turkey has also used the S-400, which has proven to be an item of diplomatic tension between it and some of its NATO allies like the United States. However, the S-400 has not performed as well as the Russians would have hoped for during the war. In September 2023, Ukrainian forces successfully attacked an S-400 system deep into Crimea with a weapon they claimed was a new, completely modern missile of domestic manufacture. The S-400 is also an expensive system, with a price tag of over $600 million per unit. Ukraine's S-360 Neptune subsonic cruise missile, the same arm responsible for destroying the cruiser Moskva and which was suspected of being involved in the attack, is much cheaper. The S-400 in Crimea should have been under the protection of the KBP Tula Pantsir S-12 SA-22 short-range air defense SHORAD program. The SHORAD system should have been data-linked to the battery's main radar system. Unfortunately for the S-400, it and its Pantsir radar failed to detect the incoming Ukrainian projectile, while the SHORAD system proved unable to shoot it down. Ukraine has had no such problems with its Patriot batteries. Beneath the waves, Russia's latest submarine is the Belgorod, the so-called Doomsday Sub. This is the largest submarine in the world, with a length of 603.6 feet and a width of nearly 60. It displaces 14,700 tons on the surface and 24,000 tons when underwater. It can dive to a depth of over 1,700 feet. Thanks to it being nuclear-powered, it can stay at sea for months. While the Belgorod is a multi-purpose vessel that's supposed to be able to hold midget submarines and other vehicles capable of conducting intelligence and surveillance, although it has shown difficulties doing so, its major function is to serve as the launch platform for the Poseidon nuclear-armed drone torpedo. The Poseidon torpedo's supposed purpose is to detonate in coastal waters and inundate nearby communities with radioactive tsunamis. Unfortunately for the Russian vessel, most of these claims, if not all of them, are hype. While the Poseidon likely poses a dangerous yield between 1 and 2 megatons, which would do significant damage to coastal areas, it would need to get close to concentrate its radioactive material into the target area. This poses a problem because the Poseidon's advertised speed of over 100 knots would make it easy to detect, especially in the shallower waters near coastal areas. The Poseidon torpedo would also produce a significant amount of waste heat because it's not large enough to host mitigation mechanisms if it's nuclear-powered as the Russians claim. Perhaps it should be unsurprising that all tests of the Poseidon torpedo appear to have been unsuccessful. America has a better track record in special-purpose underwater warfare. One of the United States Navy's best submarines is the USS Jimmy Carter, named after the 39th president, who was the only one with submarine service. The submarine is the final vessel in the Seawolf class and entered service in 2005. Unlike the Belgorod, the Jimmy Carter is not a nuclear-armed submarine, but is a conventional attack submarine. It is larger than the other 2 vessels in its class, with a length of about 453 feet. It can dive to a depth of about 1,600 feet and displaces 12,130 tons while surfaced and 9,137 while submerged. What makes it an interesting comparison with the Belgorod is that it's been modified to carry out special missions. Intelligence and surveillance missions are among the things we know about its highly secret deployments. As such, the Jimmy Carter has special thrusters in its fore and aft to keep it stationary if need be. It also has an added hull extension called the multi-mission platform that extended its length to the current 453 feet. The platform enables the Jimmy Carter to host and launch remote-controlled vehicles, special operations craft, and other means to carry out what the Navy calls enhanced warfighting capabilities. Although the Navy naturally keeps the Jimmy Carter's missions highly secret, one of its purported abilities is to tap undersea cables and communication lines. For its armament, the Jimmy Carter carries 8 660mm torpedo tubes, can lay mines, and can launch Tomahawk cruise missiles and Harpoon anti-ship missiles. The Jimmy Carter can hold up to 50 weapons in its torpedo room. Given that the Belgorod remains mostly theoretical, while the Jimmy Carter has proven itself, one can only bet on the latter if one needed to choose between the two. Russian weapons are capable, if not quite as capable as the Kremlin claims. Production difficulties and overhyping remain constant features in the Russian military. In contrast, the United States is mostly silent about its latest and greatest capabilities. Perhaps that silence speaks the loudest. What other weapon systems do you think are worth comparing between the United States and Russia? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Now go check out why all Russian weapons are a failure, or click this other video instead. Also make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. It wasn't supposed to be like this. When Russian President Vladimir Putin launched his invasion of Ukraine, it was supposed to be a quick smash and grab. His troops would storm through the country and take Ukraine, leaving him with a huge chunk of new Russian territory. And it almost worked. During the early days of the invasion, Russian troops managed to get to the outskirts of Kyiv before being pushed back out of the city. Then came the near-unanimous support for Ukraine from major Western powers. Suddenly, Putin found himself with a war on his hands. A war that is well past the 2-year point at the time of creating this video. The smash and grab has turned into a war of attrition, and you may think that Russia is perfectly suited for that kind of war. It has the second most powerful military in the world, and it can keep throwing soldiers and equipment at Ukraine until Kyiv finally has to surrender to the might of Putin. But is that really the case? Far from having a never-ending supply of equipment and soldiers to maintain its war, Russia finds itself on the brink of being the victim of the atrophy this war has created. Simply put, it's running out of everything. If Ukraine can hold on for just a little while longer, it may soon find itself fighting a toothless Russia that isn't even able to support the troops it has in the country. How is that even possible? To explain, we'll start with one of the main pieces of equipment Russia has used in its invasion: tanks. On paper, Russia is a tank behemoth. According to Global Firepower, which releases annual rankings of 145 military nations in order of their strength in an array of departments, no other country has more tanks than Russia. It's believed to have a stock of 14,777, with 10,344 of those tanks being combat-ready. Naturally, you might assume that would mean that it can keep driving more and more tanks into Ukraine, no matter how many the Ukrainians have taken out. That's until you start to look into the numbers. In April 2024, Forbes examined the state of Russia's army and how long it will be capable of sustaining its offensive. When looking at the country's tanks, it makes the important note that Russia is capable of producing around 500 to 600 new tanks annually, which it's using to replace the tanks it's losing in Ukraine. The problem is that it's losing tanks at a higher rate than it's replacing them. In February 2024, just before the war's 2-year point, Reuters published an article claiming that Russia had lost more than 3,000 tanks in Ukraine. That was equal to the country's entire pre-war active inventory. Plus, basic math shows us that losing 3,000 tanks in 2 years means that Russia is losing 1,500 tanks annually, yet it's only producing between 500 and 600, around a third of the amount it's losing. It's an unsustainable system, as well as one that's led to Russia having to rely on far less conventional methods of transporting its troops, methods like having them drive around in golf carts. A May 2024 article published in Forbes claims that 2023 saw Russia acquire around 2,100 Desert Cross 1003 all-terrain vehicles from a Chinese company. Though the name of this vehicle may sound impressive, the reality is that the Desert Cross 1003 is little more than a heavy-duty golf cart. It's compact, offers practically no protection to the people driving in it, and shockingly, it's been finding its way to the front lines. That's not the way these vehicles are intended to be used. It's entirely possible to see the Desert Cross 1003 serving as a useful runaround vehicle behind the war's front lines. It can be used to transfer troops and equipment between stations, meaning the purchase has a practical purpose. However, Forbes reports that Russia's troops are so starved of vehicles that they've taken to riding the Desert Cross 1003 into battle. The Desert Cross 1003 isn't suitable for the front lines. The vehicle weighs just 1.5 tons and has an 85 horsepower engine, with no heavy armaments or armor to protect the crew inside. For those reasons, it becomes easy pickings for Ukraine and its drones. Several reports suggest that Russians riding these golf carts have been shredded by drone fire. One such incident saw the Drone Strikes Company, typically a support branch for Ukraine's 47th Mechanized Brigade, spot a team of 7 Russian soldiers riding a Desert Cross 1003. After briefly monitoring the Russians from the air, the strike drones company concluded they'd be able to do little to defend themselves from a drone attack, so it launched one. All 7 Russian infantrymen were killed in the attack, and worse yet for Putin, the entire thing was recorded as it happened by the drones before being uploaded onto the Telegram social media network. But let's come back to tank numbers. Though Russia is only building enough tanks to replace about a third of its inventory annually, it's still able to send more tanks into Ukraine. That's according to Henry Boyd, who's the Senior Fellow for Military Capability at the International Institute for Strategic Services. He estimates that Russia managed to put between 1,000 and 1,500 tanks into service between February 2023 and 24, which would be enough to replace the tanks it's already lost. The problem? The vast majority of those tanks are older models that are extremely vulnerable to Ukrainian anti-tank defenses such as the Javelin system. The situation is so bad, according to Boyd, that only 200 of the tanks Russia sent to Ukraine during that period were new models. The rest were refurbished tanks, some dating back to the early post-World War II era of the Soviet Union. Moscow has been able to trade quality for quantity, Boyd claims, going on to point out that it could likely sustain another 3 years of heavy tank losses by relying on and refurbishing its older inventory. However, the longer Russia relies on these older tanks, the heavier those losses may become. After all, Ukraine has the ability to take out tanks en masse. It's proven that already. Sending older tanks in after new ones is simply a recipe for the country to be able to destroy more of Russia's inventory. That may be why we're seeing some Russian troops resorting to driving unarmored golf carts around Ukraine. Their tanks are being destroyed at such a rapid rate that there simply aren't enough to go around on the front line that stretches for around 600 miles. Still, perhaps it's not quite accurate to say that Russia is running out of tanks. It still has plenty of Soviet-era tanks, such as T-60s, in its stockpile. Instead, it's more accurate to say that Russia is running out of modern tanks that can actually be effective on the battlefield, forcing it to rely on older and outdated models that are becoming increasingly easy pickings for Ukraine. Of course, having to dig deep into these stockpiles also creates a problem for Russia in the future. If it wins the war in Ukraine and then decides to turn its attention to another country, such as Macedonia, it will need to spend years replenishing its tank supplies before it can launch another assault in the same vein as the one it's launched in Ukraine. We see a similar situation with Russia's armored vehicles. According to the IISS, Russia lost more than 3,000 armored fighting vehicles between February 2023 and February 2024, bringing its total losses during the war up to 8,800. That means it's losing vehicles at a rate of around 4,400 annually, leading to an even higher attrition rate than it's seeing with its tanks. On the surface, this should be a problem for Russia, at least if figures produced by London's Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, are to be believed. It points out that Russia is creating around 4,500 armored vehicles per year, which is just about enough to make good on the losses it's experiencing on the Ukrainian front lines. A pair of RUSI analysts, Nick Reynolds and Jack Watling, even point out that this rate of armored vehicle manufacture has the Kremlin believing that it can sustain the current rate of attrition through 2025. But there's a catch. Much like Russia's tanks, the supposedly new armored vehicles being sent into Ukraine aren't new at all. The RUSI estimates that around 80% of them are simply older armored vehicles, many again dating back to the Soviet era, that have simply been given a quick refurbishment and modernization before being pushed out onto the front lines. That approach is working right now. Enough of Russia's older vehicles are in good enough states of repair that they can be quickly turned around and sent to Ukraine. The problem will come as the war moves deeper into 2024, as the RUSI analysts point out. The number of systems held in storage means that while Russia can maintain a consistent output through 2024, it will begin to find that vehicles require deeper refurbishment through 2025. In other words, burning through Cold War-era stock can only get Russia so far, with its heavy vehicle losses forcing it to turn to older and older armored vehicles, all of which need much more work to bring them up to an acceptable standard than the ones the country is sending out now. Worst of all for Russia, according to the RUSI analysts, it will have exhausted most of its available armored vehicle stocks by 2026. RUSI isn't the only organization making this claim. In early 2024, the Estonian Defense Ministry also suggested that Russia is relying far too heavily on its old war stocks, preferring to refurbish what it already has rather than building new armored vehicles. The Estonian analysis examined satellite imagery to come up with rough numbers for the amounts of Russian armored vehicles that have been destroyed, are currently active, or are in storage. Their conclusion? The same as RUSI's. Russia's armored vehicle reserves will run dry at some point in 2025 or 26. The seemingly obvious solution to this problem is to build more armored vehicles. But it's here where Russia will see the sanctions placed against it by so many Western nations come to bear. Refurbishing an older vehicle requires a little metalwork, replacement of an engine, a modernization of a radio. In some cases, the vehicle may also see upgrades to its optics and armor, but that's hardly a given. The point is that Russia can minimize its use of resources to make those refurbished vehicles combat capable. Building from scratch is far more difficult. Not only does it require more materials, but Russia would also have to dedicate more labor to building new armored vehicles. It may be able to handle the latter issue, but when it comes to stockpiling what it needs, the Estonian Defense Ministry points out that significantly improving production quality under international sanctions is likely unrealistic even in the medium term. The problems Russia faces are threefold. It's going to increasingly struggle to get machine tools, high-quality components, and factory equipment if the sanctions against it remain in place. Of course, Putin has options. He could import these tools and components from China, though that option comes at the expense of quality, according to the Estonian analysts. And even that may be not as strong an option in mid-2024 as it was during the earlier months of the war. As Reuters reported in April 2024, the United States has repeatedly threatened to extend its sanctions on Russia to China. Beijing has taken that threat seriously. The country's biggest banks are now pulling back from financing transactions related to Russia, forcing many Chinese companies that still want to do business with Russia to go underground. Smaller banks that may be able to pass under the American radar, along with cryptocurrency, are becoming the go-to methods of receiving payments for these companies. But that in itself presents a problem for Russia. It means that the country can no longer make smooth transactions with China. It has to delay by using workarounds and unofficial channels. So even if Russia is able to build a stockpile of vehicle components and factory tools thanks to China, it's likely going to receive them at a slower rate than it would like. Plus, there are questions as to whether the required quality will be there when those parts arrive. The Estonian analysts say all of this adds to Russia likely being incapable of scaling up or expanding armored vehicle production beyond the levels it currently sits. RUSI agrees, with Reynolds and Watling writing in their report that this will necessarily mean a significant decrease in vehicles delivered to the military. A decrease that leads to situations like those where Russian troops are being forced to drive around in unprotected golf carts on the front lines. There is one caveat to Russia's armored vehicle conundrum. Ukraine has to keep the pace that it set during the first 2 years of the war. Destroying Russia's armored vehicles at a rate of around 4,500 per year will mean that it surpasses Russia's ability to bring more vehicles to the front lines. Ukraine simply needs to hold out, allowing the sanctions placed on Russia to force it to dig deeper into its mothballed stockpiles of armored vehicles as it struggles to manufacture new ones itself. Now let's switch the focus to people. In February 2024, CBC reported that a senior US Pentagon official claimed that Russia had lost 315,000 soldiers in the first 2 years of the war. For context, that's equivalent to the entire army that Russia sent to Ukraine, meaning Moscow has essentially needed to raise 2 armies for the war. It's perfectly capable of doing that. As Global Firepower reports, Russia has around 69.5 million people who could be part of its military, with 46.4 million fit for service and a further 1.275 million reaching military age every year. If that's the case, how could Russia possibly be running out of people for its war? Even with the loss of over 300,000, and the number may be closer to 400,000 if Ukraine's statistics are accurate, Russia has been both able to replace its lost ground troops and has more people it can send to the front lines when needed. But there are multiple issues at play here. The first is that many of Russia's soldiers simply don't want to be in Ukraine. In April 2024, AP News quoted the Russian media outlet Mediazona when it pointed out that there have been more than 7,300 cases of Russian soldiers going AWOL since the beginning of the war. That may not seem like a high number in the context of the 300,000 plus that were sent into Ukraine. That is until you realize that it represents a 6-fold increase in the number of deserters in the year before the war began. Other groups and countries are reporting record numbers too. For instance, Idite Lesom, roughly translated to Get Lost, is a group operated by Russian activists in Georgia. It exists to help soldiers who wish to desert disappear from Russian military scrutiny. It says that just 3% of the requests it received came from Russian soldiers seeking to leave the military in the spring of 2023. But by January 2024, that percentage had increased to around 30%, with the group receiving around 500 such requests during the first 2 months of 2024. Again, these numbers are small in the grand scheme of Russia's army, but they are indicative of a morale issue that could lead to even more Russian soldiers deserting as the war continues. Plus, even those who don't desert may still lack the morale needed to fight, as well as they otherwise might, weakening Russia in the process. As for countries, they are encountering more and more Russians at their borders. The AP News report points out that the United States granted refugee status to fewer than 300 Russians in 2022. However, Customs and Border Patrol says that it encountered more than 57,000 Russians trying to enter the United States in 2023, 44,000 more than it encountered in 2021. France has seen a similar increase in Russian citizens seeking asylum or refugee status, with AP News noting a 50% increase in asylum requests between 2022 and 23. And the data from Germany is similar. It received 7,663 first-time asylum applications from Russian citizens in 2023, which is more than 3 times the amount it received in 2022. It's not known how many of these people are or were soldiers. Still, there's a clear trend of Russian citizens leaving their home country because they don't want to get dragged into a war that they clearly don't support. On a wider scale, the BBC estimates that anywhere between several hundred and several million Russians had left their homes by June 2023. Interestingly, this was a trend even before the Ukraine war started, with the BBC pointing out that many who disagreed with Putin's 2014 annexation of Crimea, along with recent laws that make it easier for Russia to punish dissent, have led to many leaving. Again, these numbers may not appear especially impressive in the context of Russia having many millions more people at military age, but as with the morale issue leading to desertions, they're indicative of a divided Russia. Even some within Russia, including those who've served in its military in the past, believe Moscow is coming close to running out of people. Speaking to GB News in early 2024, a former Russian commander named Igor Girkin claimed that Russia's army is light on numbers and that it's likely the country doesn't have any broad offensives planned for 2024 in light of this issue. Girkin would know. Now in a Russian prison under charges of extremism, he played a key role in helping Russia to annex Crimea in 2014. He believes that Russia finds itself at a point where it already needs to patch up holes in the ranks, and that Moscow will have practically no one to fight its war unless Putin mobilizes at least a portion of Russia's civilian population. There have already been signs of this increasing need to mobilize people outside of Russia's active military. In July 2023, Putin revealed plans to raise Russia's maximum mobilization age to 70, with the plans even going so far as to accept soldiers back into the army who have already been discharged. The plans would also call for Russia's reservists to serve until they're 60, meaning even those who've retired could be called back up. Junior officials find themselves in a similar position. They can still be called up until they're 60. These aren't the actions of a nation that has a steady supply of competent manpower with which to win a war. And competent may be the key word here. As Russia finds itself increasingly relying on new recruits to bolster its numbers, the training those recruits undergo could grow worse. According to Understanding War, a new Russian conscript should undergo between 1 and 2 months of basic training, which is followed up by anywhere between 3 and 6 months of advanced training before they arrive at their assigned units. Once in those units, the new recruits should be trained further with the help of veterans already serving on the front lines to hone their skills and get them ready for active combat. All told, a soldier shouldn't deploy with less than 4 months of training. Yet Understanding War pointed out in March 2022 that Russia engaged in the rapid deployment of fairly untrained reservists right from the beginning of the war. It also said that Russia's reservist and contract servicemen numbers, which are an impressive 2 million on paper, may not be ready for the fight either. Historically, just 10% of those reservists go through the refresher training before being sent back to war, leaving many operating on outdated or half-remembered training from years ago. The situation is so bad that RAND reported in 2019 that Russia actually only had around 5,000 troops who could be considered reserves in the Western sense, meaning they receive regular monthly and annual training. all of which leaves the many hundreds of thousands of reservists Russia claims to have weaker than they should be. The Moscow Times backs these claims up with the story of Ivan, an anonymous soldier on the front lines of Russia's offensive in July 2022. The 31-year-old Ivan told the newspaper he'd received just 5 days of training before he was sent to Ukraine. Others had it even worse. There was a soldier in our company who didn't know how a machine gun works. I wouldn't want to be next to him in the battle. How can you fight like that? How indeed. Sending soldiers into Ukraine with less than a week of training suggests Russia is less interested in developing capable soldiers and more interested in deploying cannon fodder. Perhaps this is part of the plan: send wave after wave of poorly trained soldiers to deplete Ukraine's resources. Whatever the case may be, Russia is finding itself in a position where it's running out of well-trained troops, who are already on the front lines, and is replacing them with poorly trained conscripts and reservists who likely shouldn't be on the front lines in the first place. Still, Russia has other approaches beyond sending untrained people to war on the ground, such as its vaunted air force, the VKS. Only the VKS hasn't proved even slightly effective in the war in Ukraine either, and it's on the verge of running out of planes and pilots. In a February 2024 report, the BBC repeated Ukraine's claims that it had shot down a stunning 342 Russian planes since the beginning of the war. It's taken out nearly as many helicopters, scuttling 325 choppers since February 2022. It's worth noting that these figures haven't been independently verified, and Russia hasn't commented on the supposed losses. Still, even if they're inflated, it's widely known that Russia has failed to gain aerial superiority over Ukraine, despite having a vastly larger air force. The VKS is the second largest air force in the world, according to Global Firepower, with 2,766 aircraft in a state of combat readiness. Much like we see with Russia's tanks, this would suggest Moscow is in no danger of running out of planes anytime soon. But looks can be deceiving. In a March 2024 report by RAND, the organization points out that Russia is burning through the lifespans of its fighter aircraft to the point where its total force is less than 75% of its pre-war strength. The point here is that it's not just the hundreds of planes being shot down over the skies of Ukraine that presents a problem for the VKS. It's also the overuse of old assets that were already nearing the end of their service lives. RAND's information suggests that the VKS will lose 60 aircraft to simple overuse, meaning the planes have flown beyond the flight time they were built for by the end of 2024. That's planes that aren't going to be shot down. They'll just be cycled out of the Russian inventory altogether because they can no longer be relied upon to fly. RAND also points out that Russia is only building 20 Su-30, Su-34, and Su-35s per year. This equates to it only replenishing about a third of its stock it's losing due to age. That's before you even consider the combat losses Ukraine has inflicted upon the VKS. It's also worth pointing out that a little more than half of the VKS's tactical airframes are over 30 years old. A little déjà vu might come into play here, just as with its tanks. Russia is increasingly reliant on older equipment to maintain its attacks in Ukraine. The problem the VKS has is that its planes are far more delicate than tanks in the mechanical sense. An old Soviet-era tank can keep chugging along with refurbishments and modernizations for as long as needed, assuming it isn't destroyed in combat. That's not the case for older airframes. They have a limited lifespan and become practically useless once they've reached the end of their road. RAND speculates that these lifespan issues may not affect Russia too much in Ukraine. The problem will come later. Russia will need to rebuild the VKS once the war is over. For instance, Moscow has used its older MiG-31s and Su-27s to conduct air patrols at a distance and occasionally support hypersonic missile strikes on Ukrainian territory. These older aircraft began the war with between 20% and 35% of their original airframe lives remaining, meaning they're likely going to cycle out of service long before the war ends. Where does that leave Russia in the future? The VKS will be depleted, with Russia being forced to build more and newer planes to replace the older models it's lost. That's where the sanctions issue affecting its tank production comes into play. Russia will struggle to build more planes because it can't get its hands on the materials it needs. Perhaps that's why we're seeing Moscow only requisitioning about a third of the planes it needs to replace those cycling out due to airframes hitting the end of their lifespan. Furthermore, the combined NATO forces have access to around 800 fifth-generation aircraft, and they purchase another 100 or so annually. Russia is relying on Soviet-era planes that are also going to be unable to fly, while failing to replenish the VKS with fifth-generation jets that could keep it competitive with other countries after the Ukraine war ends. And it's not just planes that present a problem to the VKS. Pilots are also an issue. That's according to Colonel Hannes Tumsalu, who's part of the reservist Estonian Defense Forces. When examining the sinking of Russia's Novichokazk warship in 2023, he pointed out that the Ukrainians apparently struck the ship with French Scalp cruise missiles launched from Su-27 jets. Given that those missiles have a range of 155 miles, Ukraine can now fire on targets from outside of Russia's aerial defense zone. But more worrying for Russia, according to Tumsalu, is the possibility that it's running out of experienced pilots. How else could you explain Russia failing to put up a defense against the missiles Ukraine used to sink the Novichokazk? Or as Tumsalu puts it, the young do not yet understand how to fight the old, experienced ones. That's an opinion shared by Yuri Inhat, a spokesperson for Ukraine's Air Force who spoke to Pravda in May 2023 to discuss the state of the VKS. He pointed out that Russia continues to train pilots, meaning it's not going to run out of people to put in planes anytime soon. In fact, it has between 100 and 150 pilots graduating from its training schools annually. The problem for the VKS is that this plays into Ukraine's hands. Inhat says he doesn't believe the VKS will run out of pilots. However, as he states, it's obvious that the quality of the Russian personnel will diminish. Russia's early aerial losses in the war not only saw it lose equipment, it also sacrificed many pilots who had combat experience in Syria. The replacements are essentially being forced to learn on the job, coming fresh out of pilot school, only to find themselves deployed into a combat situation. Perhaps that, combined with aging airframes, is why Russia has limited the use of its VKS in the war. It's running out of good planes and quality pilots to fly them. Then there's Russia's Navy. We mentioned the loss of the Novichokazk warship earlier, and that's far from the only ship Russia has lost during the war. The strangest thing about this situation is that Ukraine barely has a navy to speak of. Global Firepower says it has just 104 assets, with most of those being simple patrol boats that aren't effective in a naval battle. We should have seen Russia take advantage of that fact. The dreaded Black Sea Fleet should have dominated the waters that give it the name, providing Moscow with a waterborne passage into Ukraine. But that isn't what's happened. Instead, Ukraine has wreaked havoc on the Black Sea Fleet. In March 2024, Ukraine announced that it had destroyed or disabled around a third of the warships in the Black Sea Fleet since the beginning of the war. That announcement came in the wake of Ukraine scuttling the Kostiantyn-Olshansky as it rested in the docks of Sevastopol, with the strike also managing to cause damage to a pair of Russian landing ships, the Azov and Yamal. It's a story that's repeated multiple times during the conflict. Russia's Black Sea Fleet has proven ineffectual, at least compared to the impact it was expected to have. Ukraine has made clever use of missile strikes, such as the one targeted at Sevastopol, as well as unmanned maritime drones to pick away at Russia's navy. Take the sinking of the Caesar Kunikov warship as another example. In a 3-minute video released following the ship's sinking, observers watched as a small speedboat sped toward the warship. After drawing nearer, there's a huge explosion. The Caesar Kunikov is seen rolling onto its port side before sinking beneath the waves. That speedboat wasn't a boat at all, at least not in the traditional sense. It was an unmanned maritime drone called the Magura 5 that Ukraine essentially used to launch a kamikaze attack, only without a human sacrificing themselves to take out a Russian ship. That incident caused Putin to strip command from the admiral who leads the Black Sea Fleet. Russia's problem is that it now faces a new era of warfare, one in which its ships are vulnerable to unmanned attacks and missile strikes, as well as the traditional warfare of old. It's not fighting a naval battle, at least not one it can recognize, with Ukraine, and yet it's still losing many of the ships it sends into the Black Sea. Worse yet, it's struggling to replace them. That's according to Katarina Zisk, a professor of international relations and contemporary history who works with the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies. She points out that Putin issued an order for a constant Russian naval presence way back in December 2013, clearing the way for the construction of special ice-class vessels that come equipped with ice-breaking capabilities to make that presence possible. Russia's shipbuilding industry presented plans, and Moscow has invested heavily in developing these vessels. Yet nothing of substance is emerging from Russia's shipyards. The LK-110, which should be Russia's next-generation nuclear-powered icebreaker, is still in its development phase. But far more worrying for Moscow is that its naval development program is stalling out, even at its earliest phases, due to the combination of economic, financial, and structural problems. Zisk explains that ineffective resources and corruption, all added to the sheer cost of developing new ships, has slowed construction to a crawl. She also points to Western sanctions as having hit Russia's shipbuilding industry hard. Those sanctions were put in place when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014 and have only intensified since the beginning of the Ukraine war. Zisk highlights how Russia's navy is cut off from much of the equipment it needs to build its next generation of ships, with diesel-powered units that used to come from Germany now being far harder to come by. Gas turbine engines Moscow used to buy from Ukraine have also dried up, for obvious reasons. Christian Arland, a senior researcher at the Norwegian Defense Research Establishment, adds to this, claiming that Russia's entire shipbuilding industry is plagued by uncertainty. Assuming that construction starts before the end of this decade, the first vessel of the class is unlikely to be completed before 2025 at the earliest, he told the Barent Observer in 2016. Time has proven him correct. Returning to the Black Sea Fleet, a May 2024 Forbes article points out that Ukraine's steady degrading of the Black Sea Fleet, it sunk 15 of the 36 warships the fleet had prior to the war, is moving at such a pace that Russian manufacturing can't keep up. It's also worth pointing out that Turkey is blocking Russia from sailing ships through the Bosporus Strait to reach the Black Sea. As such, Russia is forced to supplement its fleet with smaller ships, which are easier targets for Ukraine as it tries to build more ships in the Black Sea shipyards. Those shipyards are in range of Ukraine's drones. That leaves Russia in a position where it's trying to build new missile corvettes to enter the Black Sea, all while under constant threat of Ukrainian strikes during the construction phase. And even when those corvettes enter the Black Sea, they're getting sunk so fast that Moscow can't keep up. After all, you only have to look at what happened to the Cyclone, a Russian missile corvette that entered the Black Sea in July 2023. Just 10 months after entering service, that ship is now resting on the sea floor, a victim of a Ukrainian strike on Sevastopol. People, planes, ships, tanks, armored vehicles, Russia is gradually whittling down its supplies of all of them, forcing it to rely on outdated Soviet-era technology to continue its war against Ukraine. And those aren't its only problems. Even on the basic equipment level, Russia is struggling to provide for its troops on the ground. Numerous reports during the war suggest that Russia often sends troops into battle without even the most basic equipment they need to put up a fight. A January 2023 report published in Radio Free Europe offers one example. It reported on a video published on Telegram that appeared to show a little over 20 men standing in masks and camouflage gear, appealing for help. The video revealed those men were Russian soldiers, and their message was simple: "Please help us sort out our situation." In the video, one of the men says, "Our commander gave us an order not to retreat from our positions, but the commander gave us no cover and no support. We had only machine guns and all the rest of the weapons were damaged." That video highlighted the constant equipment issues Russia seems to have had in the Ukraine war. Other reports suggest Russian troops have received rations that are 7 years out of date. Again, that reliance on old equipment coming into play. And if more recent reports are to be believed, Russia faces extreme challenges in finding new equipment and materials to continue the war. That's according to a February 2024 article published by the BBC, which quoted a Western official who says that Russia's domestic ammunition production capabilities are currently insufficient for meeting the needs of the Ukraine conflict. The official goes on to claim that sanctions have hit Russia so hard that it's been forced to look for alternative means of supply, such as buying equipment from other countries to keep its war effort going, or requisitioning equipment that it's meant to be sending to other countries. The BBC reports that Russia did exactly that to India, keeping hold of equipment it was meant to be sending for use in the war. Perhaps that partially explains why India is now increasingly buying from Western suppliers. Russia's supply is drying up, and it can't get the weapons it needs from Moscow anymore. There's also Russia's artillery problem. Forbes estimates that Russia has around 2,000 howitzers stationed across the 600-mile front in Ukraine, with those howitzers firing a combined 10,000 shells daily. That comes out to around 5 shells per day, though it's likely more for the artillery that's stationed in the most critical areas of the front lines. Even at 5 rounds per day, that means the average Russian artillery barrel will last for about a year before its steel becomes too brittle. Those barrels need replacing. So Russia finds itself in a similar position as it does with so much of its equipment. Not only is it losing artillery by the shed load, one report suggests it lost 1,143 pieces to Ukraine since the war began, but the artillery it still has is degrading. That's led to Russia pulling thousands of Cold War-era towed howitzers out of storage. Those howitzers aren't being sent to the front lines. Instead, they're having their barrels stripped and repurposed to replace the worn-out barrels on Russia's current howitzers. Again, we see Russia burning through its old supplies instead of manufacturing new barrels, perhaps yet another effect of the sanctions placed against it. All of this leads us to a final question. Does Russia have enough equipment to see out the Ukraine war? The odds are that it does, assuming the war ends in the next year or two. But the more worrying thing for Russia is the state in which its military will be when the war ends. Will it still be seen as one of the world's dominant military powers, or will its army be so depleted, with sanctions making it more difficult to recover, that it'll essentially run out of what it needs to be considered a powerful nation by the war's end? Tell us what you think in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out why Russia's navy is in serious trouble, or click this other video instead. Question: what do coral reefs and much of the Russian Black Sea Fleet have in common? Answer: they're both endangered species and, increasingly, make for breathtaking underwater tourist attractions. Sure, maybe it's low-hanging fruit, but all jokes aside, Russia only has itself to blame for the current state of its once impressive navy, which most people, Putin included, thought would steamroll Ukraine when they invaded their neighbor in 2022. Ukraine, after all, did not technically even have a navy in the strict sense of the word. First impressions, however, can be deceiving. Over the last 2 years, Russia has managed to lose a combined total of approximately 16 ships and submarines, including the crown jewel of its Black Sea Fleet, the Slava-class cruiser Moskva, sunk by a pair of land-based Neptune anti-ship missiles. These are incredibly steep losses for an alleged great power, especially when you consider that most of the others were sunk by Ukrainian-designed, unmanned maritime drones packed to the rafters with explosives. These ingenious and relatively cheap systems, about $250,000 a pop, have become symbolic of Ukraine's technological savviness and innovative approach to naval warfare. Their asymmetric campaign has resulted in Russia's transformation from the indisputable maritime power in the Black Sea, on paper at least, to being pinned back into the eastern portion and unable to exert sea control over the region. Ordinarily, a military power with as much money, means, and manpower as Russia would double down on the omnipresent threat to its expensive naval assets. If the United States Navy were tasked with defending the Black Sea, it's easy to envision the strategy it would employ. One of its 11 carrier strike groups would almost undoubtedly be deployed to the region, which consists of an aircraft carrier, 2 guided missile cruisers for air defense, 2 LAMPS-capable warships for anti-submarine and surface warfare, and a pair of anti-submarine destroyers or frigates. The fleet would largely be insulated from traditional and hypersonic missile threats with robust and advanced cooperative engagement capabilities, DEW technology, and long-range interceptor missile technology. With enough support ships supplying munitions, fuel, and other supplies, carrier combat aircraft could conduct electronic warfare, hunt for enemy drones, and engage the bases from which they are launched almost indefinitely until the threat was entirely neutralized. US naval assets possess superior radar and electronic warfare suites to down drones, Phalanx CIWS automated guns with 20mm Vulcan cannons, and Skynex-type airburst munitions to engage close-in surface threats and drone swarms, and helicopter-launched missiles to wipe out any drone boats that made it through the fleet's wide defensive perimeter. It would almost be overkill, and the modern US military knows almost no other way. So, why doesn't Russia follow suit? Why not deploy its own aircraft carrier to the Black Sea to help neutralize the Ukrainian maritime fleet of what, in essence, amounts to a bunch of plastic water skis with a GoPro, smartphone, and a big boomstick attached to it? The answer is that it can't. The Russian carrier, known as the Admiral Flotta Sovetskogo Soyuza Kuznetsov, or Admiral Kuznetsov for short, has been undergoing a series of refittings and repairs that have relegated it to dry dock for the past few years. Though it was rumored to be ready to re-enter service by the end of 2024, experts are now wondering whether the carrier will ever sail again. Whatever its future, the vessel won't find itself anywhere near the Black Sea Fleet, or any Russian fleet for that matter, in the near or foreseeable future. Today, we're going to talk about why. If you want to measure a nation's true global power, it's often said that the best way is to look at its navy. But why? Naval vessels are expensive to produce and maintain. Only the richest nations with resources to spare can shoulder the cost of developing, testing, and projecting naval assets across the globe. As the most expensive and complex naval vessel, the modern aircraft carrier is, for good reason, almost universally viewed as the pinnacle of naval power. Those who have them can bring their bombs to bear in almost any corner of the world. Those that don't are forever doomed to the perennial role of a regional power. The history of Russia suggests that it should be at least on par with some of the world's most powerful nations at sea today. Of all Russia's service branches, the Soviet Navy was the fastest to expand after World War II. It had 421 ships of 8 different types, although these figures may be considerably larger. Its submarine fleet was world-renowned, and commensurate with its newfound status as a global power, the Soviets started to employ their navy much like the United States, to project power not just in their own geopolitical neighborhood, but around the world. From the Baltic to the Black Sea and the Arctic to the Pacific, Soviet vessels could be found performing anti-submarine, anti-ship, and anti-aircraft operations throughout the Cold War. The Soviets owed much of their post-1945 naval renaissance to the reforms of one man, Admiral Nikolai Kuznetsov, who argued for specialized missile-armed ships and submarines instead of more traditional battleships and heavy cruisers, well ahead of his time. With the seizure of East German shipyards, laboratories, and industries in 1945, Kuznetsov started to turn his vision into reality. He's widely credited for having pressed the Soviets to experiment with hydrofoils, sound-seeking torpedoes, radars, sonars, guided missiles, and other advanced propulsion techniques that kept them apace with American technological advances, and in addition, for elevating the Russian Navy onto equal terms with the General Staff of the ground forces, thus setting up the Soviet Union for better joint coordination and strategic success for much of the Cold War. The Soviets adhered to a simple naval strategy at the time. They prioritized nuclear second strike capabilities and then used bombers, submarines, and large surface vessels to threaten NATO's sea lines of communication in the North Atlantic. By the 1970s, rapid advances in Soviet submarine, missile, and nuclear technology enabled them to challenge the United States' previously unquestioned naval supremacy for the first time. It took until 1985, however, for the Soviet Union to build its first aircraft carrier. Built by Black Sea Shipyard in Mykolaiv, Ukraine, the Admiral Kuznetsov was officially commissioned in January 1991 and became fully operational in 1995. After the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, however, everything started to unravel. The Soviet Navy originally intended to launch a sister ship, the Varyag, but the project was disbanded in 1991, whereafter its incomplete and stripped hull was sold by Ukraine to China, who rebuilt the Varyag as the Liaoning, the People's Liberation Army Navy's first ever aircraft carrier. The Kuznetsov was launched at a time of unprecedented geopolitical turnover and massive budget cuts. It was fatefully marked for an inauspicious future from the start of its turbulent service history. In 1991, Ukraine officially declared its independence from the Soviet Union. That year, acting Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev thwarted a coup attempt by communist hardliners to seize control of the country's political affairs. Gorbachev envisioned a more open, decentralized Soviet government with power distributed among the nation's 15 republics. His reforms may have rubbed the old guard of communist conservatives the wrong way, but they inspired nations like Ukraine, long held under the yoke of Soviet oppression, to exert themselves in foreign affairs. Accordingly, the same year, Ukraine's first elected president, Leonid Kravchuk, told the commander of the Kuznetsov, Viktor Yarygin, that the vessel was Ukraine's rightful property. Kravchuk ordered Yarygin to keep the ship in Sevastopol until the Ukrainian government could figure out what to do. Unfortunately for Kravchuk, Russian naval commander Yuri Ustimenko swooped in and ordered the ship's crew to sail to Russian waters so it could remain in the Soviet fleet. To this day, many Ukrainians still feel the Kuznetsov was unjustly stolen from them. In reality, they may have dodged a bullet. The ship has hung like a broken-down albatross around the neck of the Russian Navy ever since, becoming far more of a burden than a blessing. Before we get into the comically tragic tale of the Kuznetsov's modern service history, let's cover the basics. Relative to modern standards, and especially compared to the nuclear-powered American supercarriers like the Nimitz-class or Ford-class vessels, the Admiral Kuznetsov is modest, unwieldy, and inefficient, and that's putting it mildly. It is 1,000 feet long, it has a 236-foot beam and a 23-foot draft, and displaces 58,000 tons when fully loaded. Steam turbines, turbo-pressurized boilers, 4 shafts, and 4 fixed-pitch propellers drive the vessel through the water, each producing 2,011 horsepower. The ship has a maximum speed of 29 knots. By comparison, the Ford-class carrier, which has unlimited range, displaces double the weight, or 100,000 tons, holds double the aircraft and well over twice the crew, and is over 30 meters longer, can still travel 1 knot faster. The power generated by the Ford-class's 2 A1B nuclear reactors generate 250% more electrical capacity than the Nimitz-class carriers, enabling them to keep pace with far smaller vessels. The Kuznetsov does not run on nuclear power and has a maximum range of 9,800 miles and operational deployment time of 45 days before it must return to port. In their infinite wisdom, when the Soviets laid the keel of their lone carrier, they decided it would run on mazut, an outdated petrochemical that hasn't been used regularly for 50 years. Once seen as an eminently viable fuel for naval energy because of its high volume-to-energy ratio, it was soon found not only to be environmentally unsound, but dangerous for the ship's own crew. Mazut, you see, is incredibly vicious and tar-like. When burned, it emits a cloying, dense cloud of black smoke that clings to sailors' clothing and skin. In 2017, the vessel gained global notoriety when Britain's then Defense Secretary Michael Fallon dubbed it the Ship of Shame, as it passed through the waters close to the English coast, belching black smoke. So what exactly can the Kuznetsov do when it isn't in port topping off its fuel tanks with fresh batches of mazut? On paper, the carrier can carry 18 Su-33s, 6 MiG-29Ks, 4 Ka-31s, and 2 Ka-27s. It's designed to sail alone, and as a result, carries greater firepower than her US counterparts, who rely on escort vessels for mutual protection. Its armaments include 12 SSN-19 shipwreck, long-range high-speed sea-skimming SSMs, 24 VLS units loaded with 192 SAN-9 Gauntlet SAMs, and 8 Kashtan CIWS with dual 30mm machine guns, and 8 AK-630 CIWS. Compared to the 4 Phalanx CIWS and 4 Sea Sparrow launchers, each with 8 missiles carried by the Nimitz class, Admiral Kuznetsov is well armed for both air defense and offensive operations against hostile shipping. The problem, as you'll see later, is merely getting and maintaining the ship in the fight, not the fight itself. The way the Kuznetsov launches its aircraft is perhaps the most recognizable design feature, or flaw, depending on who you ask. Rather than utilize a modernized steam catapult to hurl heavily laden aircraft into the air off the carrier deck at breakneck speed, the Kuznetsov utilizes an old-school bow ramp. You know, the type of thing you and your friends built in grade school to launch your bike into the air in your front yard. The chief flaw of the bow ramp is that it supposes severe limitations on the types of payloads you can launch, which, in turn, constrains the types of missions you can conduct. Physics and gravity exert more of an influence on unassisted bow ramp launch operations. Consequently, the Kuznetsov's crew must adhere to strict takeoff weight limitations, which restrict the amount of ordnance and fuel a jet can carry, and in turn, reduces the jet's offensive effectiveness and range. When the carrier launched in 1995, Russian naval officers were optimistic that the Kuznetsov, deployed in tandem with their powerful submarines, might be able to help their nation remain a major global sea power, even as the country navigated its uncertain future. It didn't take long for fate to take its course. On its first deployment to the Mediterranean in 1996, the carrier was anchored off the port of Tartus, Syria, to conduct its first set of continuous flight operations. At one point during the mission, the carrier's evaporators broke down, stranding thousands of Russian sailors aboard with no fresh water. It was the start of an almost endless stream of technical, mechanical, and engineering issues. Over the next 20 years, Admiral Kuznetsov conducted a series of additional deployments and demonstrations in the Mediterranean, North Sea, Barents Sea, the Atlantic, and the Black Sea. Working with other Russian surface ships, it was pretty common to see the carrier involved in large-scale exercises, rescue operations, escort missions, and naturally, extensive maintenance whenever something broke or needed revitalization. In 2005, one of the carrier's Su-33 aircraft accidentally fell off the back into the Atlantic, one of the first indicators of the vessel's accident-prone reputation. 4 years later, a short circuit sparked a small fire aboard the ship while it was anchored off the Turkish coast. Carbon monoxide poisoning led to the death of one Russian sailor. Just a month later, the carrier found itself in the middle of a massive oil spill that resulted when it tried to refuel at sea with several other Russian vessels off the southern coast of Ireland. The crew was very grateful to return to dry dock for scheduled repairs over the next year. It was business as usual for 2 more years before the next incident struck. In February 2012, after a long, meandering journey around the tip of Scotland and into the Mediterranean, the Admiral Kuznetsov lost propulsion and set adrift in the Bay of Biscay on its return to its home base of Severomorsk. Embarrassingly, the carrier had to be towed the 2,700 miles back to Russia by tugboat, a gesture symbolic of the ship's next decade of service. It would not return to the high seas until 2014, having conducted just 6 overseas patrols across its 23-year lifespan thus far. Still, Russian naval officials were optimistic by the mid-2010s that despite strict financial constraints and recurring technical glitches, the Kuznetsov could remain operational well into the 2030s. Theirs was an incredibly rose-colored prognosis. By 2016, when the carrier set to sea en route to the Mediterranean, it had to be accompanied by 7 other vessels, including an ocean-going tugboat as a precaution due to potential propulsion failure. It pretty much always goes out with a tugboat, noted Dmitry Gorenberg, a senior research scientist in the Strategy, Policy, Plans and Programs division of the CNA. It's in extremely poor material condition, he added. The pilots are not proficient at all, they don't spend enough time at sea. Another popular military blog at the time put it more succinctly, calling the ship a piece of crap. And, well, they were right. In late 2016, things got pretty dire for the old admiral. Though its carrier air wing had been upgraded with the latest and greatest Russian multi-role aircraft and naval attack helicopters, its latest deployment to the Mediterranean suffered from a shortage of trained pilots, which limited the amount of fixed-wing aircraft it could launch at any given moment. As the carrier group approached the eastern coast of Crete, one of its MiG-29Ks took off from the carrier and returned as planned, only to find the Kuznetsov's deck crews were frantically repairing a broken arresting cable. The carrier commander, with plenty of time to divert the aircraft to a nearby airbase, dithered in the hopes his crew could fix the problem in time. Well, they couldn't. While circling the carrier, the plane ran out of fuel, forcing the pilot to eject into the sea. 2 weeks later, the Kuznetsov participated in its first ever combat operations, launching a series of Su-33 strikes against ISIS in Syria. The Russian Defense Ministry pointed out that the strikes were responsible for killing at least 30 enemy militants, including top field commanders. But Kuznetsov simply couldn't stay out of the news. A week later, another Su-33 crashed into the sea attempting to land on the carrier. The culprit? That darned arresting cable. It turns out it had been damaged even more than the technicians thought in the latest landing attempt. This was the straw that broke the camel's back. The carrier's air wing was transferred ashore to continue ongoing military operations. Meanwhile, in early 2017, the Russian Defense Ministry announced that the Kuznetsov would cease all operations in Syria, return to Russia, and begin a long-needed modernization program to overhaul its technical systems and extend its service by 25 years. This is where things get even more weird. You see, when ships go into dry dock for extensive upgrades, things are supposed to be safer. The environment is controlled, refittings occur on predictable, tight schedules, and crews have access to all the cranes, tools, and equipment they need to do their job properly in an ideal world. And so the Kuznetsov arrived at PD-50, one of the world's largest floating dry docks located at the 82nd Repair Shipyard in the village of Rosselyukovo, serving Russia's northern fleet based out of the neighboring port of Severomorsk, to have an invasive checkup. In the autumn of 2018, fate, karma, bad luck, or whatever you want to call it, again interrupted the Kuznetsov's regularly scheduled programming when the entire dry dock suddenly convulsed and sank into the sea, collapsing cranes onto the carrier's deck and sending shipyard workers scrambling for their lives. Somewhere along the line, the pump system that controlled the dry dock's buoyancy lost power, flooding its ballast tanks with water far in excess of their maximum point. 4 dock workers were wounded, another went missing. While certain Russian officials claimed the Kuznetsov was undamaged in the incident, other outlets were quick to report that there was now a 5-meter gash in the hull of the ship around the waterline and that the deck was supposedly opened up with intricate machinery exposed when the crane fell on it. Much to the Navy's consternation, the industrial accident looked set to delay the Kuznetsov's refit longer than anticipated. And then, a year later, in 2019, the ship caught fire again. Though Russia no longer possessed a dry dock large enough to accommodate a vessel of that size after the sinking of PD-50, it had stubbornly pressed on with the tortured refit when a fire broke out during repairs to the first power unit, sending a thick plume of black smoke into the sky as burning diesel fuel and power cables caused a thick cloud of acrid black smoke to fill the ship's cramped corridors and increased the engulfed area 6-fold to 120 square meters. This estimate made by the Russian TASS news outlet was said to be well short of the mark. Other agencies posited that the blaze covered up to 600 square meters. 8 repairmen had to be rescued from the inferno, 1 remained unaccounted for. Most blame the fire on safety violations. It would be par for the course. The fire damage cost an estimated $8 million, although some sources cite that number may be higher. The Kuznetsov by this point had already become the brunt of international jokes in the press and military circles. Its embarrassing overhaul was only adding insult to injury. Repairs were delayed through 2021, with Russian officials citing bad weather as the chief cause. Okay, it took until May 2022 to return the ship to a new dry dock built in Murmansk after the sinking of the PD-50. When it finally drained in July 2022, repairs continued in earnest. That is until December 2022, when the ship caught fire again. In Samuel Taylor Coleridge's famous poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, a man at sea inexplicably shoots an enormous seabird that had been flying alongside his vessel for several days. As the bird died, the wind immediately ceased blowing. Irate with the mariner and fully convinced the bird had magically made the wind blow, his crew made him wear the albatross around his neck until it rotted, a heavy burden that acted as a constant reminder of his senseless decision. By this point in the Admiral Kuznetsov's long life, an honest reading of the past 30 years would seem to indicate that the vessel, much like the mariner's albatross, is an unnecessary burden around Russia's neck. Russia seems to be blithely ignoring the chronic shortcomings, tragic losses, and damaged prestige incurred by the vessel's poor design. They remained committed to getting the ship operational sometime in 2023. Now things are looking as bad as ever, as the ship, like the Albatross, seems to be decomposing at the 35th Ship Repair Plant in Murmansk. A recent Defense Intelligence report indicated that even at this late stage of its refitting, the ship could not relocate from the dry dock to one of the repair plant's piers under its own power, but that it still had to be pulled by a series of several tugs. They tried and failed to move the hulking steel mass, owing to the critical condition of the ship's hull. Examinations to the hull revealed that the metal structures below the third deck of the ship were significantly corroded. The holds are filled with muddy water, which makes it impossible to examine the ship in detail from the inside. Today, repairmen are warning the Russian military to deploy the Kuznetsov at their own risk. Its condition, they argue, leaves it with a high probability that it would sink or capsize. Russian naval officials, repairmen, and defense contractors are now hurling blame at one another for the vessel's dismal bill of health. Now nobody knows whether the Kuznetsov will be able to return to service in 2024 or not. This all begs the question, if it's more trouble than it's worth, why doesn't Russia simply scuttle the ship? It all goes back to the way Russia hopes the world perceives it as a global and not a regional naval power. For decades, Russia has been in the process of modernizing its surface fleet with larger numbers of smaller, technologically advanced vessels. Yet it has doggedly clung to many of its older, larger units, vestiges of the Soviet era when it was truly on the brink of becoming a major sea power. Just as Ukraine's sinking of the Moskva in April 2022 was viewed globally as an attack on Russia's perception of itself as a sea power, one expert has observed that scrapping the Kuznetsov would be akin to scrapping the idea of Russia being a great sea power. This, put simply, is just not on the cards for Russia's current cast of leaders. Today, Russia can't afford to build any new large warships of consequence. Until it achieves its long-term strategic goals in Ukraine, this trend looks set to continue for the foreseeable future. In the interim, the Russian Navy will be forced to maintain and modernize its current fleet, so even though its lone carrier is prone to spontaneous combustion, puts its crew in undue danger, remains reliant on external tugs for propulsion, and occasionally forces its pilots to eject at sea, it is and will remain the golden child of the Russian fleet until its leaders see the writing on the wall. Now go and check out why all Russian weapons are a failure, or click this other video instead. The S-400 air defense system has become a hot commodity on the global stage, hailed as the crown jewel of military hardware. From Algeria's acquisition in 2021 to Belarus beefing up its arsenal in 2022 to counter NATO, and even China securing units to guard the contentious Senkaku Islands and Taiwan from 2018, the S-400's client list reads like a who's who of global powers. India joined the club with a whopping $5.3 billion deal in 2018, undeterred by political sanctions from its ally, the United States. Meanwhile, Turkey, a NATO member, faced real sanctions, trading access to the F-35 program for the Russian defense system. The widespread adoption and the risks nations are willing to take to possess the S-400 beg the question, is it really the ultimate shield it's cracked up to be? Can it truly outsmart fifth-generation stealth fighters? In this video, we're diving deep into the world of the S-400, examining its strengths, shortcomings, and debunking myths. We'll also talk about why its Nebo-M radar system sucks, and how its lack of interceptors make it vulnerable compared to other air defense systems out there. And we also look into questions like, can Putin's prized air defense system pinpoint and neutralize US fighters before they deploy their arsenal or coordinate a strike from afar? Let's see what our military experts have to say. But first, it's origin story time. Russia's S-400 Triumph is an evolution of the Cold War-era S-300 air defense system. It's a mobile system capable of shooting down aircraft, drones, and cruise missiles. It also has a terminal ballistic missile defense capability. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the S-400 has the mission equivalent to the United States' Patriot missile defense system. Born amidst the post-Soviet turmoil of the early 90s, the S-400, a successor to the formidable S-300, emerged not as a reinvention, but as an evolution. With 70 to 80% of its technology rooted in its predecessor, how did Russia enhance this system to meet the modern battlefield's demands? The leap from S-300 to S-400 brought significant advancements, upgraded radars, new missiles extending its reach, and fortified defenses against electronic attacks. But with these improvements, just how much more effective did the S-400 become? Introduced in 2007, boasting a range of up to 400 kilometers and the capability to engage 80 targets at once, the S-400 represents a leap in defensive technology. Each battalion's 8 launchers, equipped to fire 4 missiles each, stand ready to challenge the skies. But that's not all. The S-400's primary weapon system is the 48N6 missile series, which has a 250-kilometer range and can intercept incoming ballistic missiles across a radius of 60 kilometers. Reportedly, these missiles are capable of intercepting hypersonic projectiles up to a speed of Mach 8, flying at the edge of its range. Intercepts of targets flying at speeds over Mach 14 have also been reported. 2 additional missiles are supposedly under development for the S-400 launcher. The first is the 77N6. Unlike the other 2, this missile uses hit-to-kill technology equivalent to the Patriot's PAC-3. Such technology provides a particular advantage in a nuclear missile defense role, as the lack of a detonation would limit radioactive fallout. The 77N6 was in testing as of July 2021 and was supposed to enter service in 2022. The same missile was also meant to be available for Russia's newer S-500 system. However, both this missile and the S-500 appear to be behind schedule, perhaps unsurprisingly. The third missile supposedly in the S-400's arsenal is the 40N6. This projectile is supposed to bring the S-400's range up to 400 kilometers. In July 2023, it reportedly completed new tests. In November, the Russian Ministry of Defense announced that it would be producing at least 1,000 of these missiles in 3 years, though sanctions make this production rate questionable. The experts at CSIS are also skeptical that the S-400's radar capacity will allow the 40N6 to operate at its purported range. The S-400 is one of the key pieces of military infrastructure for the heavily fortified Russian enclave of Kaliningrad on the Baltic coastline. In addition to territorial defense, the Russian strategy for its deployment there has been to use it as an anti-access area denial system to disrupt the movement of NATO forces should a confrontation arise. The S-400 also saw service with Russian troops deployed in Syria, and it's a key aspect of Russia's strategy to defend Crimea. On February 25, 2022, the day after the invasion, the S-400 got its first confirmed combat kill when it shot down a Ukrainian Su-27 fighter jet operating around the country's capital of Kyiv. The kill of the plane, piloted by Colonel Alexander Oksenchenko, who was well known on the airshow circuit, was reportedly the longest-range downing of an aircraft on record. The S-400 continued to prove its worth in early March 2022, when it shot down 4 more Ukrainian Su-27s on the 5th of that month. Aside from its purported long-range and high-altitude defense, the S-400 is also capable of being used in offensive roles. In January 2023, Russia used the air defense system as part of a missile attack on Kyiv, with the staging point being Bryansk Oblast within Russian territory. Debris recovered after the attack by Ukrainian forces confirmed that the missile in question came from the S-400. So in the S-400, Russia has a formidable defensive and potentially offensive system, but just how good is it, really? Unfortunately for the S-400, the results in real-world, non-biased tests seem to indicate that it doesn't quite live up to the hype the Russians have built for it. At this point, we're not exactly surprised. Given Putin's track record of overhyping his weapons' capabilities in the past, perhaps skepticism was warranted all along. So what exactly falls short in the S-400's capabilities? Perhaps the best example came from the Turks. In December 2021, only a few years after it purchased the S-400 in the face of American sanctions, Ankara announced it would be going full throttle in developing a domestic air defense system to replace the Russian import. This is because Turkey actually accused Russia of fraud in the advertising of its S-400, These accusations came through the results of a series of tests in early 2020, where the S-400 was put up against drones and F-16 fighter jets. The Turks found that although their S-400 systems could indeed track targets up to 400 kilometers away, the said targets needed to be at an altitude of at least 20 kilometers for the air defense to work at the range it was advertised for. If the target drops below 5 kilometers, the efficiency drops enough to allow enemies to attack the S-400's position. The detection efficiency at such low altitudes, the Turks claim, drops between 30 and 40%. When the target drops to an altitude of 1 kilometer, the S-400's effective detection range goes down to a distance between 70 to 180 kilometers, depending on the terrain. Below 1 kilometer, the range drops enormously to only a few kilometers. In other words, the S-400's range is highly dependent on terrain, weather conditions, and the altitude of a target. The Turks say that low-altitude missiles and loitering munitions are therefore highly effective against the S-400. This sounds pleasing to the ears, but there is a problem with the assessment, and we will look into that in a bit. Right now, let's take a look at the S-400's supposedly greatest aspect and a key part of its hype for export, the inclusion of the NEBO-M radar system. Is it all it's cracked up to be? Here's how it works. This radar uses a pair of low-frequency arrays in the VHF and L bands. Supposedly, such low-frequency radar bands enhance the S-400's ability to detect stealth aircraft like the F-22 and F-35. These planes are specifically designed to be less detectable to high-frequency radar bands because these are the bands which enable missiles to hit their targets. In contrast, lower-frequency radar bands such as the VHF and L bands are better able to detect stealth aircraft from a long distance, and they are not designed to be stealthy against these frequencies in the same way. At first glance, the S-400 system is well equipped to handle this mission. A 2014 study done by Konstantinos Zakidis of the Hellenic Air Force seemed to reveal that the NEBO-M radar was capable of detecting the F-117 Nighthawk 250 kilometers away and could still detect it at a range of 72 kilometers even when under attack from enemy electronic warfare efforts such as jamming. This seemed to suggest that the S-400 would indeed be effective against stealth aircraft and capable of shooting them down. However, there are several problems with this item of hype. First, the F-117 was retired from active service in the late 2000s, so it was a poor choice to use as an example. Second, the F-22 and F-35 are far less detectable than the F-117, with radar cross-sections between 2 and 30 times smaller. Most importantly, being able to detect a stealth aircraft is not the same thing as being able to shoot it down. Detection with a low-band radar in the VHF and L bands will not by itself allow the S-400 to shoot down an incoming F-22 or F-35 because this is not sufficient for it to get a lock with one of its missiles. Only detection at higher frequencies can successfully guide a missile home. To get around this problem, the two low-frequency bands are designed to share their data with the third band in the S-400, the high-frequency Gamma S1 array, which broadcasts in the X and S bands. These can guide a missile to its target. In essence, the two low-frequency bands first track the incoming fighter, and then the high-frequency array is capable of using that data to shoot it down, or so the Russians say. In a contest between the S-400 and America's stealth aircraft, the outcome comes down to a simple question. Will the Russian air defense system be able to detect and shoot down the fighters before they can use their own weapons or call in a strike from somewhere else? Because of their smaller radar cross-sections, the F-22 and F-35 will be able to evade detection from the S-400 at much shorter ranges than the F-117. If the F-35's cross-section is, as reported, about the size of a golf ball, the Lightning II would only be detectable up to a range of about 20 miles, and that's at a low frequency. The USAF brass has admitted that the F-35 is stealthier than the F-22, but the Raptor would have a more or less similar level of protection. These two fighters would therefore almost certainly be in a position to destroy the S-400 with a long-range air-to-surface missile before they can be detected, much less threatened with a surface-to-air missile like the 48N6. For these reasons, shooting down the fifth-generation fighters is a much taller task for the S-400 to overcome than being able to casually shoot down the fourth-generation fighters that it did in the early days of the war in Ukraine. The problem becomes more pronounced when considering that the F-22 and F-35 have electronic warfare measures. Unlike the Su-27s it had demonstrated success against in February and March 2022, America's planes would be jamming the S-400. Ukraine's planes couldn't do this. But the S-400 has another problem that makes it less effective than it's hyped to be, At best, a full battalion would be able to launch 32 missiles in the sky. All air defense systems will be overwhelmed if the volume of incoming fire exceeds the system's capacity to respond. This is how Hamas overwhelmed Israel's vaunted Iron Dome in its October 2023 terrorist attack. The thousands of rockets that it launched into Israel, low-tech as they were simply too much for Iron Dome to overcome in such a short time. A typical Iron Dome battery consists of 3 or 4 launchers with a capacity of 20 missiles per launcher, making for a total between 60 and 80 missiles in the system. Its high capacity is one of the reasons it's proven so effective in countering projectiles that threaten Israeli population centers. The American-Norwegian NASAMS is another air defense system with a high payload capacity. A typical NASAMS-2 battery consists of 12 launchers, each of which has 6 missiles apiece, meaning that it can have 76 interceptors on standby. A Patriot battery, meanwhile, hosts 6 to 8 launching stations. Each launcher can carry 4 PAC-2 missiles or 16 PAC-3 missiles. As such, a typical Patriot battery has between 24 and 128 missiles, depending on how many launchers there are in the battery and whether the PAC-2 or the PAC-3 is the intended missile. So we see that the S-400 is lacking in interceptors compared to other air defense systems out there, including the Patriot, its closest American equivalent. The best way to overwhelm it would therefore be to launch a series of low-altitude cruise missiles or drones. We don't need to look at the Turks' test in 2020 to bear this conclusion out. In April 2017, the United States launched a series of cruise missile strikes against targets in Syria in response to the Bashar al-Assad regime's use of chemical weapons in that country's civil war. The American cruise missiles specifically targeted the Shirat Air Base near the city of Homs. There were S-400 systems in the area to defend the base. However, they failed to intercept the incoming American projectiles at a distance of 175 kilometers, far less than the purported 400-kilometer range that it has, and even less than the 4A-10-6's effective range of 250 kilometers. Not a single American cruise missile was shot down in that operation. A year later, the United States again launched a cruise missile attack against targets in Syria with a similar level of success. The S-400 may also be vulnerable to much lower levels of technology than that seen in the United States' 5th-generation fighters. Recall that the S-400 bases at least 70% of its technology on the older S-300. The supposedly advanced NEBO-M radar system is the same as that used on the S-300, and the older air defense array has proven vulnerable against strikes from cruise missiles and drones like the Turkish Bayraktar TB2. In both Syria and the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan in 2020, the S-300 and its NEBO-M radar proved less effective against both of these arms. However, in an actual conflict between the United States and Russia, things would not be this simple. The S-400 is at its best when it's part of an integrated air defense network with other assets like AWACS planes. The Turks did not use its S-400 system in this way during their tests, so its less than perfect results for them might not have been surprising. The same goes with the Syrians in 2017. The presence of these planes will increase the efficiency of the S-400 significantly. All the same, Ukraine has proven quite good at detecting and shooting these planes down in early 2024. Russia has lost 2 of its 9 modernized operational A-50 AWACS planes to Ukrainian air defense missiles. In an air environment against an adversary like the United States, with even longer-range missiles and almost certain air superiority, if not air dominance, these planes would have a much harder time operating unimpeded, especially when the USAF can deploy the coming AIM-260 JATM in large numbers by the end of the decade. Russia would need to hide its A-50s at greater distances and behind fighters and air defense systems to defend them, making them less effective. In Ukraine, the S-300F air defense system proved incapable of stopping the cruiser Moskva, the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, from being sunk through a combination of drones to provide distraction and subsonic Neptune cruise missiles to deliver the killing blows. The poor weather that day again seemed to suggest that the S-300 and its successor, the S-400, had comparatively poor performance against targets flying at low altitudes, especially in less than optimal environmental conditions. The S-400 has had other problems in Ukraine. On August 23, 2023, an S-400 system defending Crimea mysteriously went up in flames near the village of Olenivka, on the peninsula's westernmost point. It was not clear what exactly caused the explosion, though experts suspected that a long-range air-launched Storm Shadow cruise missile provided by the British and French was responsible for the incident. It's also possible that the strike could have come from a Neptune or Harpoon anti-ship missile modified to hit targets on land, although this was less likely. Either way, even in the presence of a more integrated air defense network, the S-400 proved incapable of defeating a Ukrainian precision missile strike. According to the Oryx blog, Russia has lost one command post for an S-400, one 5P-85T2 launcher, 5 5P-85SM201 launchers, one 92N6A radar station for the S-400, and one support truck for the air defense system as of March 7, 2024. All of these have been destroyed. The destruction of the support truck in January 2024 seemed to confirm that Russia had deployed its S-400 system on internationally recognized Ukrainian territory for forward combat operations. Previously, the Russian armed forces had been known only to deploy the S-400 in Crimea within Russian territory and within the borders of Belarus to create a north-south area of coverage over the entire front in Ukraine. Despite its hype as a stealth-killing system, the S-400 likely isn't going to be taking out F-22s and F-35s anytime soon, even if it can detect their presence with its low-frequency radar. The United States' coming 6th-generation fighters, the Air Force's NGAD and Navy's F/A-XX, will almost certainly be even less observable than the 5th-generation fighters, making the S-400's task of defending the skies over Russian positions that much more difficult. The F-35's situational awareness adds another wrinkle to the S-400's prospects in a conflict, as its flying supercomputer attributes enable it to link with other assets in all branches of the United States Armed Forces to create what the brass at the Pentagon calls a kill web. This will be especially pronounced when the F-35 gets its Block 4 upgrades. So, for example, the F-35 might be able to spot an S-400 air defense system, and then, instead of attacking it itself and making it more vulnerable to being counterattacked, it can instead relay the data to a ship offshore that can then in turn send a barrage of cruise missiles against the Russian target, or command drones to attack it in order to cut down on costs. The coming 6th-generation fighters in America's air fleet will improve upon these abilities. All of this is not to say that Russia's S-400 is a poor-quality system, but rather that the claims that it can destroy stealth aircraft just because its low-frequency radar might be able to detect them likely would not stand up to scrutiny in a real-world confrontation. Its comparatively low amount of available ammunition per battery would also be a problem in a full confrontation with the United States and NATO. The S-400 remains capable, but like usual, just not as capable as Russia claims. What do you think about Russia's S-400? Was it worth it for Turkey to acquire in the face of American sanctions? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Now go and check out why the war in Ukraine shows the US military would destroy the Russian military, or click this other video instead. Also, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more military analysis from military experts. Russia's Su-57, Putin's first stealth fighter in service since December 2022, has been through a rollercoaster of development woes and skepticism. Yet despite its impressive tech, doubts remain about its true capabilities, especially its stealthiness. So what's the deal with its long road to completion, and can it really slip under the radar like it claims? Let's dive in. Tom Cruise is no stranger to impossible missions. For several decades, perhaps with a bit of assistance from the Hollywood special effects department, he has been fighting bad guys in fast-moving action sequences on sea, land, and in the air. In 1986, in the film Top Gun, he piloted a state-of-the-art, 4th-generation US F-14 Tomcat against fictional Russian MiG-28s. In 2022, he returned to the cockpit of the by-now out-of-date F-14 to dogfight against 5th-generation advanced Russian fighters. Cruise, in the guise of ace fighter pilot Pete Mitchell, manages to shoot down 2 enemy aircraft. He downs one of them the old-fashioned way, with a burst of cannon fire. Another member of his squadron manages to account for another one. In this second version of the film Top Gun, the plane the movie directors chose to represent the bad guys was a real aircraft, the Russian Su-57 single-seat multi-role stealth fighter. Since its original maiden flight back in 2010, this is a plane so rarely seen in the skies that it might almost be a fictional aircraft. Ironically, if Maverick and his buddies had shot down 3 Su-57s in real life, that would have probably accounted for the entire Russian serviceable fleet of stealth fighters. Joking aside, Russia's Su-57 fighter is Russia's first attempt to join a very exclusive club of nations, those that can boast a stealth fighter within their air force. Information is always a little bit hazy around Russian military equipment. We think the Su-57 officially became operational in December 2020. Until then, it was only China and the United States that had stealth fighters. The Su-57 has had a painful and protracted birthing process that has spanned decades, cost billions of rubles, and seen 2 of the aircraft written off in accidents before it was operational. It may have been used in combat against Ukraine in the last couple of years, but we only have the claims of the Kremlin and little in the way of independent confirmation. But the Su-57 certainly seems to be a high-tech and capable aircraft, and Western analysts have been taking a keen interest in its development. So why has it taken so long to develop? And is it any good? And perhaps more to the point, is it stealthy? Before we get to that, let's start with what seemed to be a promising origin story. Founded by Pavel Sukhoi in 1939, the Sukhoi Design Bureau has developed a long and proud tradition of producing combat aircraft in the service of first the Soviet Union and then Russia. Sukhoi produced fighter and ground attack aircraft during the Second World War. From 1945 onwards, the company embraced the new challenges in technologies offered by the arrival of the jet engine, producing fighters, bombers, and reconnaissance aircraft. Sukhoi also branched out into civilian aircraft. In 2006, the Russian government merged several aircraft companies into the United Aircraft Corporation. Sukhoi was part of this merger, alongside Mikoyan, Tupolev, Ilyushin, and several other legendary Russian aircraft designers and manufacturers. And thus the development of the Su-57 began. Here's how it went down. Almost as soon as a new piece of high-technology military equipment comes into service, designers and planners are already looking ahead and thinking about its replacement. In the 1980s, the Soviet Union was looking ahead for the next generation of combat aircraft to provide the fighters of the 1990s and beyond. The concept was to have an aircraft capable of a range of tasks, able to attack targets in the air, on the land, and at sea. Experimental projects were initiated, and some fell by the wayside amid cost increases and program delays. One fighter prototype only took to the air in 2000 and was, at that point, 9 years behind schedule. The Russian Defense Ministry started afresh and in 1999 released a new set of requirements for a fighter aircraft that could, for cost reasons, replace both the MiG-29 and the Su-27, both sizable fleets of aircraft. It was intended that the aircraft should be smaller than its predecessors as well, to fit in with limited budgets. The Sukhoi development team took part in the invitation to submit proposals. It came down to a competition between Sukhoi and MiG. In April 2002, Sukhoi was selected and invited to produce prototypes, with an intended flying trial date somewhere in 2007. At the time, the aircraft design had a prototype name of the T-50. Sukhoi themselves are speculated to have used the American F-22 Raptor as a baseline guide for their design of a stealth fighter. The Sukhoi aspiration was for a family of stealth aircraft to emerge out of the Su-57 design work. Because much of the technology was very new, as the design of the aircraft proceeded, other aircraft were used as testbeds for aspects of the T-50, such as the weapons bays, engines, and flight control systems. Sukhoi made use of their own Su-27 multi-role fighter for this, and even retained some of these innovations on the Su-27 to make an upgraded Su-27. This proved so successful that the Russian Defense Ministry bought this new Su-27 version and renamed it the Su-35. The Su-35 is actually quite similar to the Su-57, apart from the stealth aspect, which the Su-57 reportedly has and the Su-35 does not. The project started to come together. The basic design was approved in 2004, and this triggered the release of more Defense Ministry funding into the project. In August 2007, the Russian Air Force announced the development was complete and that trials would soon be starting. The Soviet Union and Russia have marketed their military hardware all over the world. A fifth-generation stealth fighter aircraft would be no exception. Getting a large overseas order early on would take the financial pressures of the Su-57 project. India had bought much Russian military equipment in the past, and expressed very strong interest in acquiring the Su-57. There was talk of potential sales of 200 or 300 aircraft. A deal was signed between Russia and India in 2010. But this is where cracks literally started to emerge in the program. A dozen flying and non-flying prototypes had been produced. Although flight testing and the maiden flight were due to begin in 2007, the flights were delayed. There were problems with the engines, flying trials were pushed back to 2010, and when they did take place, it soon became apparent that the airframe structure had significant problems. Stress cracks were appearing after only a few flights. The Sukhoi designers scrambled to find solutions and had to implement some major design adjustments in order to reinforce the basic aircraft structure. In June 2014, one of the prototypes caught fire just after landing. Although the pilot escaped unharmed, the aircraft was written off. Some of the parts and components were cannibalized for use with the other prototypes. The original plan had been to start delivering production versions of the Su-57 from 2015. This clearly was not going to happen. The delivery date slipped to 2020. During these unforeseen difficulties, the Russian government began to reassess and reduce its purchasing plans for the aircraft. The Russian Defense Ministry would buy 52 Su-57s by 2020 and then another 150 by 2025. But the program remained troubled, as purchasing plans and delivery dates all fluctuated. After Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea from Ukraine in 2014 and the subsequent low-intensity conflict in eastern Ukraine fought by Russian-backed separatists and covert Russian forces, international sanctions began to impact on Russian finances. The Russian defense industry relied on importing high-tech Western electronics and other equipment. These important components became harder to access on the open market. Sanctions were to become even tougher when Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. India started to back away from the big purchase order of Su-57s and in 2018 cancelled the deal completely. Large-scale production of what was a very expensive aircraft was now looking very doubtful. But in 2019, Russian President Vladimir Putin jumped in to tip the scales, perhaps even with his eye on a coming war with Ukraine. In May, the Kremlin released a statement that 76 Su-57s would be bought and would be delivered by 2028, but production of the aircraft remained slow. Reportedly, one was made in December 2020, and another 4 had emerged by the middle of 2022. Despite the problems, the aircraft had now flown publicly at airshows, and analysts had been able to take a look. The aircraft was light, maneuverable, and agile. Commentators were impressed. Marketing brochures and Kremlin official statements hyped up the capabilities, not least the fact that it was a stealth aircraft with long-range strike capability. But good intelligence analysts try not to take anything for granted. If it could do everything that the brochure advertised, the Su-57 would represent a very credible opponent for current US and NATO frontline fighter aircraft, such as the Eurofighter Typhoon, the F-22 Raptor, and the F-35 Lightning. But one former US pilot wryly observed, "Is it a current threat? Well, not now, because there is only one of them." Another ex-pilot observing the smooth takeoff and acrobatics of an Su-57 at an airshow was impressed but slightly dismissive of the fancy aerial display designed primarily to please the tourists. He was more interested in how the aircraft would perform with a full load of fuel and a heavy payload of weapons. Despite Putin's apparent faith in the aircraft, on December 24, 2019, the first official production-grade aircraft crashed while being delivered to an airbase. The pilot ejected and survived. The cause is unclear, but is believed to have been some form of control system malfunction. So what sort of capabilities have been advertised for the Su-57? The aircraft stats look impressive, reporting a speed of Mach 2 to 2.1 and a ceiling of 20,000 meters. A high fuel carrying capacity appears to give it a much longer range, 1,500 kilometers, just under 1,000 miles, than its Su-27 counterpart. It also has the option to fit an extendable refueling probe to further increase the range. Later production models are intended to receive a newly designed engine, the Isdalai 30, to deliver more power and performance. The Su-57 is capable of supercruise, maintaining flight speeds beyond Mach 1 without having to use high-fuel expensive afterburners. The Su-57 has 6 radars to enhance pilot situational awareness. The N-036 Bielka radar has a range of 400 kilometers. The F-16, about to be received by Ukraine, only has a range of 300 kilometers. It can carry many different permutations of weapon types, missiles, cruise missiles, and bombs, enabling it to strike at ground, sea, and air targets. A GSH 30mm automatic cannon provides a small anti-air or air-to-ground attack capability. Apparently, hypersonic missiles are being designed with the Su-57 in mind. The infrared search and tracking system can handle multiple targets. But let's spend a little bit of time thinking about the main selling point for the Su-57, its stealth capability. Inevitably, these specialist skills are closely guarded state secrets, but we can make a few observations. A stealth aircraft is simply an aircraft that has been designed to make it harder for radar to hit the aircraft and bounce back to the radar receiver and produce a ping or a blip on the radar screen. This can be achieved with several careful shaping features to the plane's outline. The Su-57 aircraft has incorporated many measures indicative of stealth capability. The wing and control surfaces are carefully shaped and angled. For stealth missions, the weapons are carried in 4 internal weapons bays, rather than hanging off the outside of the aircraft, which would make the aircraft more radar visible. Large parts of the aircraft surface are treated with radar-absorbing material, RAM. A key search and track sensor faces backwards when not in use, with the forward edge treated with RAM. The pilot canopy has been prepared with a metal oxide coating to reduce the radar profile. Extra care has been paid to every aspect of the assembly of the aircraft. Every rivet has to be flush with the fuselage or otherwise concealed. When assessing an aircraft's stealth capability, the experts talk of a radar cross-section. They mean what aircraft profile is visible to a radar system. By one estimate, the Su-57's radar cross-section, or RCS, is 30 times smaller than that of the Su-27. But some Western analysts suggest that although the frontal radar cross-section may be reasonably effective, the profile from the rear looks to be less well concealed. This would mean that it's probably harder to pick up on the radar if it's coming straight at you, but it might be more visible from the side or the rear. A crucial selling point for military hardware is whether you can point to a credible track record of military success. The Su-57 does not have this. Or does it? It's actually quite difficult to give a definitive answer. The Russian Defense Ministry has claimed that the Su-57 has been used in action in Syria and in Ukraine. This is hard to verify, but let's take a look at what we do know. Our journey begins in Syria. In late February of 2018, 2 Su-57s reportedly landed at the Khmeimim military airbase on Syria's Mediterranean coastline. Khmeimim is directly adjacent to the Bashar al-Assad International Airport and, since 2015, has been effectively handed over to the Russians as part of their military operation in support of the Assad regime. It's well defended by Russian military personnel and air defense systems, and is a key logistics and accommodation node for Russian forces. The base has come under attack from shelling and drones in 2018. The Su-57s came accompanied by other aircraft, including Su-25s and 35s. Depending on the route taken, this could have been a flight of 1,000 kilometers or so, providing a good flight trial in its own right. It's possible that another couple of Su-57s also arrived at Khmeimim a few days later. What the Su-57s did there is unclear. It may simply have been a public relations exercise to demonstrate Russian capabilities and global reach. The aircraft were only there for a few days. After they departed, the Russian government made reference in March to Su-57 combat trials in Syria and claimed on 25th of May that an Su-57 had fired a cruise missile in combat. Later that year, the Russian Defense Ministry released footage of the Su-57s in flight and stated that 10 flights had taken place. It seems highly likely that the Su-57s dipped their toes into the Syrian conflict, but overall, this looks more like a PR stunt than a serious military deployment. Okay, but what about Ukraine? Russian claims that the Su-57 has been active during the invasion of Ukraine have been more persistent, but equally difficult to prove. Although it might seem a bit of a no-brainer that the Russian military would want to use their best aircraft in a large-scale war on their border, using the Su-57 over Ukraine would be fraught with military and reputational dangers. According to estimates, there are perhaps 10 to 15 Su-57 aircraft in total. It's fair to assume that not all of these would be operationally ready at any one point in time. This amounts to a very small potential strike force, and one that could not realistically afford to lose more than 1 or 2 in combat. Multiple Russian sources started claiming that the Su-57 was used in action during the war, from 2 or 3 weeks after the start of the invasion. On 22nd of June 2022, Russian state media referred to the Su-57 combat operations in relation to Ukraine. On the 5th of November 2023, Russian media claimed that the Su-57s had been active over Luhansk, a region of Russian-controlled eastern Ukraine. Perhaps more credibly, the British Ministry of Defense Intelligence Group have assessed that the Su-57 has almost certainly been used in the war. Okay, so what could this mean? The Russian Air Force has suffered catastrophic losses during its invasion of Ukraine. According to plausible estimates, well over 300 aircraft from a Russian Air Force operational strength pre-war of around 900 aircraft. The Ukrainian air defense system has greatly improved during the conflict and now presents a very effective shield against Russian aerial encroachment. This looks likely to have caused the Russian Air Force to limit the amount of aircraft it risks to actually fly over Ukrainian territory. It is likely that US and NATO intelligence-gathering aircraft operating over NATO or international airspace in Eastern Europe are scooping up as much information as possible regarding Russian air deployment activities and operations and relaying this to the Ukrainian Defense Ministry. Many Russian air attacks are now conducted from Russian aircraft firing long-range missiles from Russian airspace. But even this does not make them entirely safe. Ukrainian air defense weapons include the Patriot, which has a range of 50 to 100 miles. Drones and other missiles also put Russian aircraft at risk on their bases inside Russia. So it's likely that Russia is remaining highly cautious with the Su-57 over Ukraine, not wishing to overplay their hand and expose it to undue risk. From what we've seen so far, the Su-57 is being used to undertake just enough aerial activity to be able to claim operational experience, but not enough to use it in a serious way that might knock out key Ukrainian military targets by using its stealth capability. If an Su-57 crashed in Ukraine, it would be a major propaganda blow for Russia and potentially a rich source of technological and tactical intelligence information made available to the Ukrainians and their Western allies. The views from the Ukrainian military suggest they certainly do not rule out the possibility that the Su-57 has been deployed in some way. One Ukrainian colonel observed that it's hard to identify specific aircraft types from the radar screen. The Su-25 and Su-35 can conduct similar non-stealth attacks with a similar profile. The colonel may know a little more than he's letting on. Perhaps the only real proof that a Russian stealth fighter was operating over Ukraine would be if a Ukrainian ground target suddenly exploded and the Ukrainians were at a complete loss to explain who had done it. That would be the perfect demonstration of a stealth attack. Conversely, however, if a Russian stealth attack was seen on the radar and easily intercepted, the Su-57's credibility would be instantly blown. So the question is, does Mr. Putin feel lucky? One thing's for sure, it's been a troubled path for Sukhoi's 5th-generation stealth fighter, and unfortunately for Russia's Su-57 program, it looks to be having very similar problems to the Russian T-14 next-generation main battle tank program, which we covered in one of our previous episodes. Both projects have struggled with design issues, have little to show for several decades of effort, and are now struggling with funding, technology, and a lack of crucial overseas sales. There are very few, only handfuls really, of the equipment known to be in existence, and no convincing demonstrations that either the aircraft or the tank are operationally ready in any meaningful sense. But work is still ongoing. Sukhoi is developing an Su-57 upgrade, known as the Su-57M. Flight trials of the Su-57M reportedly took place in 2022. There has been talk of a smaller naval version capable of landing on an aircraft carrier, but Russia does not have a viable carrier force at present. Perhaps of more immediate interest, in July 2021 there was reporting that a 2-seater variant of the Su-57 was being built. This was described as a training version, but also something that might provide for a weapons officer to operate unmanned aerial vehicles or drones. Drone technology is causing something of a revolution in military affairs, due in large part to the innovations emerging from the Ukrainian battlefield. This is definitely something to keep an eye on. There is little concrete evidence that the international arms community have been wowed by the arrival of the Su-57. Although international sanctions are unlikely to shut down the Su-57 program, lack of critical technology, funds, and buyers will likely continue to restrict the forward progress of the Su-57 project. Potential sales opportunities still look limited. Brazil dropped out in 2013, preferring to buy the Swedish Gripen and build it in Brazilian factories. India cancelled its deal with Russia over 5 years ago and is looking to build its own homegrown stealth fighter. Turkey was briefly interested. In 2019, an Su-57 turned up at a Turkish technology display in Istanbul, but announced in early 2020 that it too was now planning to build a homegrown stealth fighter. Algeria may receive some in a few years' time, and Iraq has expressed interest, but they will probably be watching Ukraine closely for evidence of the much-promoted stealth capability. But not all technological innovations leap straight from the drawing board and into a fully functioning and successful piece of equipment. We suggest that it would be too simplistic to write off the Su-57. It is a light, powerful, and agile aircraft with significant capabilities beyond other current Russian combat aircraft. And some of the new design and technological features that emerged from Sukhoi's extensive development efforts seem to have cascaded down to the benefit of other Russian fighter systems. So perhaps we need to wait and see what happens later this year. F-16 fighters have been offered to the Ukrainian Air Force by Denmark and Norway. These will replace the aging Ukrainian MiG-29 and Su-27 fighters. Ukrainian pilots are already being trained on F-16s, and we may well see them take to the skies over Ukraine even as soon as this summer. But what do you think? Is it possible the Russian Air Force is holding back its small Su-57 fleet in anticipation of a conflict with American aircraft technology? This would suddenly take us beyond a Hollywood movie and into a real contest between American 4th-generation aircraft and Russian 5th-generation. Is this likely to happen? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Once a force to be reckoned with in the global arms trade, Russian weaponry has seen a significant shift. What's behind the decline in Russian arms exports, and who has risen to become the world's second largest arms dealer? And can you guess who's still holding the top position? At the height of the Cold War, one of the major indices of Soviet power was the quantity of arms it exported to the rest of the world. Whether propping up an associate in one of many ongoing proxy wars, bolstering the strength of a member of the Warsaw Pact, or reinforcing the rise of Third World tyrants-to-be, there always seemed to be a willing market for the stockpiles of unused Kalashnikovs, MiGs, and T-62s, crowding the Soviet Union's many surplus depots. When the USSR collapsed in the early 90s, however, Russian arms exports went into sharp decline. Under the leadership of Russian President Vladimir Putin, the country experienced a temporary resurgence in arms sales throughout the 2000s and 2010s. This upward trend coincided with more frequent military interventions outside Russia's borders, especially in places like Georgia in 2008 and Syria in 2015. Smack dab in between these two conflicts, Russian arms exports peaked in 2011, when the country virtually matched American arms exports, rifle for rifle, shell for shell, and tank for tank. It did $8 billion worth of deliveries to 35 different countries in that 1 year alone. For a moment, it looked like Putin really was recapturing the type of geopolitical influence enjoyed by his Soviet forebears. Then in 2014, Putin invaded Ukraine and, well, things started to fall apart. Over the past decade, Russia has witnessed a precipitous decline in arms exports, which by some estimates has contracted as much as 70%. Some analysts call the waning profits and the subsequent loss of prestige one of the many casualties of Russia's war in Ukraine. If the war in Ukraine is partially to blame, it doesn't look like things are going to change anytime soon. Russia can ill afford to export arms to eager buyers around the world if it can barely keep up its own staggering vehicle and equipment losses in Ukraine. The longer the war stagnates, the more equipment Russia will be forced to throw into the meat grinder. The more equipment it consumes, the less there is on the table for Russia to export. It might be simple maths, but it's also a damning equation for the Russian arms industry. Naturally, one man's problem is another man's opportunity. Since the end of the Second World War, there has been an almost immutable balance in global arms exports between the United States, the biggest seller of global arms worldwide, and the Soviet Union, whose mix of high-end aircraft, air defense, and battle tanks, as well as reliable, durable, and cheap small arms weapons, found ready buyers the world over. Now that Russia's declining arms exports have left a vacuum in the marketplace, other arms sellers are eager to fill the void. In fact, in 2021 and 22, Russia was finally surpassed by another nation as the second largest arms dealer on planet Earth. Just who that is might surprise you. Today, let's explore what effect the collapse of the Russian arms industry might have on its near and long-term geopolitical and economic prospects, and what Russia's performance in Ukraine might mean for prospective buyers around the globe. It's a demonstrable and somewhat jarring fact that today, the once vaunted Russian military, with its endless reserves of military materiel, is now more dependent on arms sales to China and India than any time since 2003, but at much smaller export volumes, and with both India and China continuing to develop their own import-competing arms industries. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the economic outlook in Russia looked pretty bleak. Russia had one ace up its sleeve, however. China was experiencing stupendous growth, and as it had during the Cold War, relied heavily on Russian arms sales to sharpen the sword of its growing military, until its own GDP, industry, and global industry had reached rough parity with the United States. Between 1990 and 1999, Russia reinvigorated its status itself as a major arms seller on the global stage, with a torrent of cheap equipment sales to China and its rapidly growing neighbor India. Military experts have argued that while Russia's arms deals never amounted to more than a small portion of Russia's annual trade exports, between 2 to 5% overall, it has relied on weapon sales as a metric of soft power, a way to build patronage networks and advance its economic and strategic objectives around the globe. This worked with former Soviet states and power-hungry dictators and revisionist rogue leaders like Syria's Bashar al-Assad and Venezuela's Hugo Chavez, but it also worked especially well with Chinese and Indian leaders who could afford to infuse their military power with the more expensive systems Russia had on offer. There's a reason why the strength of Russia's arms exports have almost become synonymous with the strength of its global military partnerships and alliances. Once you buy a high-tech weapon system from another nation, you essentially lock yourself into a dependability cycle for the long haul. Former US Assistant Secretary of State Andrew Shapiro likened this binding process to the act of buying a modern smartphone. When someone buys a smartphone, they're not simply buying a piece of hardware. They are buying a system that includes the operating system, the system's software for email, photos, and music, as well as access to many other available applications. Therefore, an individual is in fact entering into a relationship with a particular smartphone company over the life of that phone. Similarly, when a country buys a fighter jet or other advanced defense systems from a foreign company, they are not just getting the hardware. They are buying a larger system, one that will need to be updated and repaired throughout its lifespan, which in the case of a fighter jet can be as long as 40 years. This means that in purchasing the hardware, the buyer is actually committing to a broader, long-term relationship with the United States. This helps explain why it's been so hard for certain countries to denounce Russia over the past 2 years, despite the illegality of its invasion of Ukraine. Just look at India, whose military stocks are 70 to 80% composed of Russian-made equipment. When a nation becomes majorly dependent on foreign arms exports, it becomes exponentially harder to alter the course without severely impairing one's own defense capabilities in the short term. It costs a lot of money too. Historically at least, inasmuch as Russia's military could demonstrate its effectiveness on the global stage, it could convince buyers and buyers-to-be that their equipment was worth purchasing. Since its botched invasion of Afghanistan, a spate of successful, smaller-scale interventions effectively filled this role, building global confidence in the reliability and utility of Russian weapons systems. Then in 2014, things started to change. Russia informally invaded Ukraine after the Maidan protests, inviting economic sanctions from the West as well as geopolitical pressure on Third World countries to no longer purchase Russian arms. Between 2013 and 2017, Russia enjoyed a share of between a quarter and a fifth of global arms exports and more than 35 customers worldwide. Between 2018 and 2022, that number contracted by 1/3, leaving Russia with just 16% of global arms exports and a mere 12 customers. Fast forward to Putin's special military operation, and Russian arms sales reached their nadir. He simply could not afford to sell the systems he soon realized he would need to maintain Russia's stranglehold on what it conquered after February 2022. That year, Russia managed $2.82 billion in arms sales, a paltry sum compared to the nearly $8 billion it was selling a decade prior. Today, France, of all countries, has stepped into the void and has surpassed Russia as the world's second-largest arms exporter, with China taking the bronze in third place. The invasion of Ukraine has cruelly exposed the quality of high-grade and cheap Russian weapon systems alike, like a store's customers passing on discounted bargain bin goods because they can clearly see the product's defects. Russian customers were undoubtedly disturbed by not only the inefficient organization and employment of Russian weapons systems in Ukraine, but the exposure of glaring technical defects and design flaws that resulted in so many tank turrets being hurled into orbit. Russia had to temporarily replace armored losses with new, old-stock BTR-80s, BMP-1s and 2s, and those archaic T-62s themselves, 10 years older than the first Ford Mustang. The fact that Russia's long-anticipated Armata, Boomerang, and Kurganets fighting vehicles have also failed to make an appearance on the battlefields of Ukraine is equally worrying, as it reveals broader industrial bottlenecks that reflect poorly on Russia's ability to deliver what it promises over the long term. Back in 2015, Russia said there would be 1,000 T-14 Armatas in service by 2025. By 2024, that means there should at least be some T-14s in service, right? Yet today, there is still no production line for the Armata, and few, if any, are in the Russian ground forces service. Videos of Russian soldiers complaining of badly rusted rifles, poorly maintained artillery shells, and unserviceable logistics vehicles have also been aired on Telegram and other social media platforms since the conflict began, speaking to the dilapidated state of Russian war materiel. Conversely, think of the benefits reaped by American arms dealers who are receiving real-time endorsements for state-of-the-art weapons being used against a near-peer threat for the first time. The poster child in this example is clearly America's HIMARS system, which has proven so effective in Ukraine that Taiwan, Poland, and Australia have not only put in for a new wave of orders, but Germany, yes, Germany, recently agreed to conduct a joint project with Lockheed Martin to create its own version of the platform. It's clear that Russia's customers are beginning to see the writing on the wall. If they are serious about their own defense, they should probably look elsewhere. Many are beginning to recognize that Russia's own defense needs will constrain its ability to fulfill its long-term arms orders. This at least was the conclusion of Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić, who in the aftermath of Russia's November 2022 withdrawal from Kherson, expressed Serbia's need to create its own future with regards to its military capabilities. Armenia recently jumped ship too, criticizing Russia's failure to deliver the goods or offer meaningful support in its war with Azerbaijan. So, when you account for the decreasing dependence of India and China on Russian arms exports over the past decade, the destabilizing nature of events like the COVID-19 pandemic, and the poor showing of Russian weapons systems in the ongoing war in Ukraine, you can see why Russian arms exports have taken such a big hit. Today, Russia has an intractable problem. Though it still has plenty of Soviet surplus left over from the Cold War, its foreign customers are increasingly aware of Russia's inability to maintain these aging systems or prevent their descent into obsolescence. Likewise, as Russia becomes even more isolated on the global stage, sanctions will restrict access to advanced technologies and components it needs to produce sophisticated weapons. These include the optical systems, bearings, machine tools, engines, and microchips, which have notoriously gone missing throughout Russia. These limitations will undoubtedly affect the competitiveness of Russia's arms in the global market, as arms manufacturers prioritize the restocking and rehabilitation of lost or damaged equipment in Ukraine. There have, for instance, been reports in the Russian media that certain arms manufacturers failed to deliver artillery systems for Vietnam or aircraft for Algeria on time. According to a recent CSIS study, in a radical turn of events, Russia has now begun to try to purchase back much-needed military components and technology from countries such as India and Myanmar. Russian tank manufacturers in late 2022 were importing $24 million worth of components simply to cope with requests to modernize telescopic sights and cameras on old models pulled from storage. The more these cases compound, the more Russia's traditional customers will be forced to diversify their suppliers. Vietnam, who has started courting other American, European, and Asian nations to source its military hardware, is one good example. The passage of the 2017 CAATSA Act by the US Congress in the aftermath of Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea has also contributed to the decline in Russian arms sales. The act imposed secondary sanctions on countries who engage in significant transactions with Russia's defense sector. Reinvigorated after the 2022 invasion, CAATSA has disincentivized many recent customers from making Russian weapon orders, adding to the woes of Russia's defense industry. Here's the hard data. As of late 2023, Turkey had a deal in place to buy a series of S-400 SAM systems that has since been put on hold. A deal for 16 Mi-17 helicopters made by the Philippines has since been cancelled. Russia did not make a single delivery to Egypt in 2022. Between 2018 and 2022, combat aircraft and helicopters accounted for roughly 40% of Russian arms sales. By the end of 2022, it had contracted out only 84 compared to 1,371 aircraft and helicopters ordered for the United States and 210 for France. There were only 13 pending deliveries for SAMs by late 2023. There were only 444 pending deliveries for tanks. Serbia cancelled its order of 2 Ka-32 helicopters owing to Western sanctions and war-related shortages. In 2022, Russia lost the markets of Greece, Cyprus, Finland, and a series of countries in Central and Eastern Europe, despite their historical reliance on Soviet and Russian-style systems and repair services. It's customary for nations at war to invest heavily in R&D, refine and improve existing weapon systems, and thus gain an edge over the enemy. Russia's declining arms export profits will severely limit its defense industry's long-term ability to innovate. Instead of advancing the development of its fifth-generation fighters, the Su-57 and Su-75, Russia has had to focus on ensuring it can maintain and replace its current fleet of second, third, and fourth-generation fighter aircraft. As it does so, it will continue to fall behind countries like China, whose R&D expenditures far outmatch Russia's in most categories. If it cannot afford to innovate, Russia runs the risk of repelling additional customers. It's a self-fueling cycle. Today, half of Russia's total arms exports are aircraft: MiG-29s, Su-27s, Su-30s, Su-35s, and Yak-130 jets doled out to Vietnam, China, India, Algeria, and Egypt. CAATSA sanctions have made it nearly impossible for Russia to find buyers for its most advanced offering, the Su-35, a plane it describes as a fourth-generation plus model, owing to the extent of its modifications and modern capabilities. China and more recently Iran are the only markets willing to buy, but Russia can hardly produce enough to warrant a serious bid. Even before the war in Ukraine, Russia only produced 5 Su-35s in all of 2021. Engines are a big part of Russian exports too, accounting for around 32% of its entire arms trade by late 2023. Russian-made engines extend the service life of Russian military aircraft, especially those currently employed by the Chinese Air Force. Lately, China has looked askance at Russia's ability to deliver the goods on its engine orders. It should surprise no one, but Russia has been struggling to fulfill its engine production quotas because, you guessed it, it relied heavily on Ukrainian manufacturers such as Motor Zich and Zarya Mashprojekt, which used to provide key components in Russia's engine production. According to several analysts, it's likely that the 2022 sanctions regime will further limit the Kremlin's ability to build high-quality aircraft engines in the foreseeable future, forcing China to take concrete steps towards the indigenization of the engine industry. Could these shortcomings lead to engine trouble for the broader Sino-Russian military alliance? The further you go down the list, the more Russia's issues compound. Russian manpads, anti-aircraft, and guided anti-tank missiles have always been safe purchases for Russia's faithful customers. Yet since the start of the war in Ukraine, Russia has lost hundreds of its own expensive air defense systems and has struggled to maintain the defense industrial capacity required to replace them. Hence, Moscow has to import from China. Russia has lost more than 2,000 tanks in Ukraine, roughly two-thirds of its entire fleet by some estimates, which has put severe pressure on its primary tank manufacturer, Uralvagonzavod, to replace them. It has 444 tanks on order, but this is far less than the 634 pending delivery from the United States, the 717 pending delivery from China, and the 990 pending delivery from the new boy on the block, South Korea. It's now been almost half a decade since Russia made any notable exports of large naval vessels. Smaller cruisers and patrol ships occasionally come off the line, but Russia's shipbuilding and submarine industry have been forced to work under similar constraints as Western sanctions limit their access to Western components. PR from the sinking of the Moskva and other ships didn't help either. Today, the Russian shipbuilders receive more acclaim for their capacity to produce peerless sunken reefs than their ability to manufacture safe and effective military vessels. Arms exports were once one of the few areas Russia could claim geopolitical parity with the West. No longer. Not only has it fallen behind the United States defense industry over a remarkably short span, it's now witnessing one-time customers like India and China diversifying their sourcing of military equipment and expanding their own arms export capabilities. Putin can expect Russia's arms industry to constrict even further as long as it forges ahead with the long-term occupation of Ukraine. Back in May 2022, Ukrainian officials in Kyiv came up with an ingenious idea. They would take the hulks of burned-out Russian tanks, artillery, anti-aircraft, and infantry fighting vehicles and put on a sort of public exhibition in Mikhailivska Square. In August, an even larger exhibition was held on Kyiv's central Khreshchatyk Street. This time a display of more than 80 destroyed and captured tanks, howitzers, rocket artillery, and other systems. The destroyed equipment not only served as an important symbol of Ukrainian resistance in the early days of the invasion, it also reflected Ukraine's brilliant use of information warfare. For as we now know, the exhibition was not only a referendum of Russia's ineffective military, but a warning to potential purveyors of its once respected offerings: buyer beware. So what do you think? Will Putin eventually be able to bounce back when it comes to arms trade? What strategies do you think he will try to employ to revitalize Russia's arms export industry and regain its former prominence? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. When you break down the T-90 on paper, Russia's most modern battle tank looks pretty fierce. Among other high-tech accessories, it boasts a 125mm smoothbore gun, modular composite armor, and a 1,000-plus horsepower V12 diesel engine. In theory, it offers excellent mobility, protection, and firepower, along with the ability to launch armor-piercing, fin-stabilized, discarding sabot rounds and anti-tank guided missiles. The T-90 also has several variants and has been a popular export due to its relatively high cost-to-benefit ratio. Then why, you might be wondering, has the T-90 been such an epic failure on the battlefield? To be fair, it's not just the T-90s that are dropping like flies, as Russia's war with Ukraine continues. Since February last year, the Russian armored corps losses have since reached more than 2,100 tanks. That's around two-thirds of the tanks Russia initially rolled out of Moscow on their way to Kyiv. Russia has lost so many tanks, in fact, that they've had to reactivate and deploy hundreds of older models, including the T-72 Ural, T-62, and T-54-55, some of which are 50, 60, even 70 years old. And most of these have headed to the front without any meaningful upgrades, not since the collapse of the Soviet Union anyway, to their optics, fire control systems, or armor. It probably wasn't the first choice, one could imagine, of the boys back at the Kremlin to roll out these older models. This decision likely has something to do with the recent spike in losses of their prized T-90s. In total, Russian troops have been forced to scrap or abandon nearly 60 of these 53-ton, three-person tanks, roughly 15% of Russia's pre-war inventory, with most being lost in only the last few months. But wait, aren't these supposed to be the baddest tanks around? That's certainly what the Kremlin's been saying. Before we get to the specific factors contributing to the T-90's proposed survivability, or lack thereof, let's take a moment to address one other important point. When we zoom out, there's an argument to be made that the increasing number of T-90s being destroyed on the battlefield in Ukraine might actually be a negative sign of things to come for our friends in Kyiv. How's that? Well, let's look at it like this. One reason that so many T-90s have been destroyed recently, but certainly not the only reason, is that there's been more of them deployed to destroy. Translation: Russia's current production of T-90s has been picking up, as Putin's nearly two-year effort to boost tank production finally seems to be paying off. Apparently, Russia has been able to work around some of its increasingly tighter foreign sanctions, including those on critical high-end electronics that it was once importing from France. As mentioned before, the number of destroyed or captured T-90s accounts for roughly a quarter of Russia's pre-war inventory. This overall number, however, does not include the hundreds that have been produced by the Ural-Vagonzavod plant in Sverdlovsk Oblast since the start of 2022. Russia's increased productivity could become a serious problem for Ukraine, considering its main tank plant, the Malyshev factory in Kharkiv, currently lacks the capacity to produce new tanks from scratch and is limited to performing upgrades and repairs. This leaves Ukraine's armored forces mostly reliant on foreign donations if they intend to deploy a fleet of modern Western-style tanks, which they have, including German Leopard 2s, British Challenger 2s, and the American M1 Abrams. But are foreign donations going to be able to match Russian tank production? Well, it's hard to say, but it probably wouldn't hurt for Ukraine's Western allies to throw in a few more tanks, especially because the Ural-Vagonzavod plant can, hypothetically, produce enough new T-90s in the next 6 months to match Ukraine's current inventory of comparable, modern battle tanks. But even if this theory is true, and an increasing number of T-90s are being destroyed largely because more are being manufactured and deployed, that certainly isn't the whole story. The overall effectiveness and functionality of the T-90 has been a matter of debate since the beginning, with many distinguished experts expertly concluding that overall, the T-90 is a piece of junk. First introduced as the T-72BU, then renamed the T-90 to distinguish it from all the other T-72 variants, the T-90 was thought to be one of the most well-protected tanks in the world, while also boasting one of the most heavily equipped battle systems currently on the market. After being officially brought into service in 1992, the T-90 has received a number of upgrades and subsequent name changes. In 2004, it was renamed the T-90A, and then in 2016, it was upgraded and rebranded again as the T-90M. Then, after its most recent upgrade in 2017, it came to be called the T-90MS. There were also less popular variants along the way, but those aren't worth mentioning here. Since its conception, one of the major selling points of the T-90 has been its relatively low cost. Save for the most recent variant, the T-90MS, which runs closer to $4 million, the full line of older, less expensive T-90 models can still be purchased and exported for around $3 million. Even though it continues to be produced primarily for use by the Russian Army's armored division, the Kremlin has sold and exported thousands of T-90s, mostly T-90S variants, to countries such as Algeria, Armenia, and Iraq. In fact, India alone is now in possession of more than 2,000 Russian-built T-90Ss. Underneath the hood, so to speak, of all currently available T-90 variants is a V12 diesel engine. The most powerful, coming in at 1,130 horsepower, can be found on the T-90MS. The T-90 is also about 20 tons lighter than the M1 Abrams, and was designed to accommodate and be operated by, thanks to its auto-loading firing system, just a 3-man crew. Upon closer inspection, however, the effectiveness of both the engine and loading system have come into question. But more on that a bit later. So what about firepower? Well, if the T-90 has one thing going for it, it definitely has a lot of that. The T-90's 2A46M4 125mm smoothbore main gun can fire a range of high-tech ammunition options, including armor-piercing, fin-stabilized discarding sabot rounds, as well as the anti-tank guided missiles mentioned earlier, also known as the 9M119 Reflex, or by NATO as the AT-11 Sniper. These high-tech projectiles have a maximum range of 4,000 meters, with a flight time of 11.7 seconds, and can, under certain conditions, even take down helicopters. Also in terms of firepower, the T-90 features 2 externally mounted machine guns. One is a 12.7mm cord heavy machine gun that has a cycle rate of fire of 700 to 800 rounds per minute and can be remotely operated from within the tank. The other is a PKMT 7.62mm coaxial machine gun. And when it comes to protection, in addition to conventional armor plating, modern T-90 variants also come equipped with 2 very high-tech defensive systems. The first is the Shatora-1, an active protection system made by the Russian company Elektronik Torg that includes a 360-degree laser warning receiver complete with automatically triggered countermeasures that deploy if the tank is painted by an enemy laser. This device can even orient the tank's main gun in the direction of the laser's origin. The Shatora-1, among other features, also comes with an infrared jammer and a grenade-launching system that has the capacity to discharge smoke grenades which release an infrared obscuring aerosol cloud. The modern T-90's second line of defense is its Contact 5 Explosive Reactive Armor, or ERA, which is essentially a layer of high explosive sandwiched between 2 metal plates designed to minimize the damage of explosive projectiles by detonating just prior to their impact. Pretty fancy, right? ERA was specifically designed to counter a range of advanced weaponry, including missiles and rockets carrying high explosive anti-tank warheads, as well as highly deadly sabot rounds, which separate after being fired and turn into a thin, fin-stabilized rod made of depleted uranium. Once a sabot round impacts an enemy tank, the kinetic force it creates while penetrating also creates a steam of molten metal that pours into the cabin with it. This instantaneously increases the temperature and pressure inside of the sealed turret, killing, or rather cooking, everyone inside. The T-90 also comes with a magnetic mine detection system that, when functioning properly, uses an electromagnetic pulse to disable mines before the tank can run over them. So then, what's the deal, you might be asking? Why aren't these extra fancy protection systems making the T-90s unstoppable? For one, these systems haven't performed so well against long-range anti-tank guided missiles. There was one report that stated a Ukrainian took out 2 T-90Ms back-to-back using an AT-4 anti-tank weapon. If that report is accurate, this would be a very impressive set of skills. The Swedish-made Saab AT-4, given to the Ukrainians by the US and Sweden, is a lightweight, shoulder-launched anti-armor weapon. However, despite delivering an 84mm projectile out to a range of 300 meters, this unguided weapon should not be effective against a T-90M's reactive armor, which the manufacturers claim is effective against not just low-speed rockets and missiles, but also tank rounds coming in at hypersonic speeds. There are, it seems, even more embarrassing ways to lose a tank, which Russia has also discovered recently. Apparently, a group of Russian technicians accidentally set fire to a T-72 they were attempting to repair. In the confusion, the ammunition on board caught fire and exploded, completely destroying the tank and damaging 2 others nearby. The loss of this tank and the 2 T-90Ms suggest that a more complex set of problems might be plaguing the Russian military. And this makes the actual durability and effectiveness of the T-90 more difficult to determine. Is the hyped T-90M any less vulnerable than earlier models? It's hard to tell when it's regularly being used without proper tactical or common sense. Another reason the T-90 was poorly conceived compared to other main battle tanks is that its underlying design is outdated. Ultimately, as we mentioned before, the T-90 is simply an improved version of the T-72. Essentially, the turret of the T-80 and the hull and drivetrain of the T-72 combined together and covered over with reactive armor. And because the T-90 is in its essence only an update, it retains all of the defects of its bargain-built older brothers. Its inherent shortcomings, leading to the apparent failure of the T-90's ultra-modern defensive systems, is one thing. But this tank has also been the victim of tactical incompetence and has regularly been rolled into impossible no-win situations. In modern warfare, advancing tanks are supposed to be supported by infantry for the very purpose of suppressing enemy ground troops who might be using anti-tank weapons, like the AT-4. Deployed armor should also have artillery support, if only to help mitigate any long-range threats. Sending tanks forward without defensive support, as Russia has continued to do in Ukraine, makes them extremely vulnerable, especially to infantry units using shoulder-launched weapons. Mobile ground units, when allowed to get in close, can carry out ambushes at short range, which allows them to focus their attacks on a tank's more vulnerable target areas. A particularly vulnerable area for these tanks, that's also been exposed by the creative fighting tactics being used in Ukraine, is the roof. So it seems the T-90 has had some trouble with the anti-tank missiles that are fired from elevated positions, and ultimately come down onto these vehicles from above. The T-90's 360-degree active protection system is supposed to protect from this sort of attack, and its failure to do so might suggest that this fancy new system isn't as infallible as first advertised. A range of other deficiencies came to light after the first T-90 was captured, intact, from the battlefield in Ukraine. With the tank now safely in their possession, military specialists from the Ukrainian Center for the Study of Captured and Prospective Weapons and Military Equipment were able to conduct an analysis of all internal equipment and armaments, and went on to publicly announce their findings in March of 2023. When, around the same time, another T-90A was captured, this one was apparently handed over to the US, also for the purpose of research. But when one of Russia's most modern pieces of armor was spotted on a trailer in Louisiana, then subsequently photographed, a debate surrounding the tank's unlikely appearance on American soil exploded on social media. It isn't fully known what the US ultimately had planned for the tank, but we do know what Ukraine did with theirs. They ripped it apart, literally and figuratively. Once the team of Ukrainian experts had completed their investigation, they claimed to have uncovered little more than an old T-72 hiding beneath the shell of widespread Russian propaganda, labeling Russia's new war machine an overall failure and not nearly the breakthrough the Kremlin had been all along claiming it to be. The team of engineers from the Center for the Study of Captured and Prospective Weapons and Military Equipment also noted that the well-praised automatic loader was largely the same design as could be found on the older T-72, the only major difference being that the ammo was now stored in a separate compartment outside the turret. This modification, however, created the complication of tankers having to fully exit the vehicle in order to load ammunition into the main compartment, which, to be done with any practical sense or relative amount of safety, would require that the tank leave the field of battle. Talk about taking yourself out of the fight. The center also reportedly discovered significant limitations concerning the T-90's B92S2F V12 diesel engine, which Ukrainian engineers claimed did not have sufficient power to reliably propel the vehicle, a claim that was supported by videos of T-90s getting stuck in the mud. They also noted that the highly praised Kalina computerized fire control system had incorporated in its design not only civilian electronic components, but some of Western origin, while other electronic components had been assembled without adhering to moisture control requirements, resulting in increased oxidation, shortened lifespan, and unexpected failure. But the embarrassment of Russian tank builders isn't the Kremlin's biggest problem here. If Ukraine persists in revealing the secrets and vulnerabilities of the allegedly advanced systems and technologies of the T-90, this could potentially create a serious financial challenge for Russia in the future. By giving other countries the information needed to produce their own, while simultaneously diminishing the hype surrounding the Russian-made T-90, sales are bound to diminish. And this is no small sum we're talking about. Russia has currently received a combined total of nearly $10 billion for exported T-90s from India and Algeria alone. But a fair amount of damage seems to have already been done. As reports of the T-90's mediocrity have continued to surface, Many foreign companies that had previously signed contracts with Russia have swiftly cancelled those agreements. All these technological and mechanical shortcomings, though, are only part of the bigger story. The lack of success the T-90 has had on the battlefield in Ukraine cannot be truly understood without looking at the opposition they faced. It would be a disservice to Ukraine's ferocious troops to do otherwise. Combined with grit and determination born largely of national pride, Ukrainian forces have also received an impressive amount of anti-tank weaponry from the US, as well as other allies. From the US alone, Ukraine has received more than 10,000 Javelin anti-armor systems, 90,000 other anti-armor systems and munitions, 8,000 tube-launched, optically tracked, wire-guided TOW missiles, 35,000 grenade launchers and small arms, 4 million rounds of small arms ammunition and grenades, and a whole slew of laser-guided rocket systems, rocket launchers, and anti-tank mines. According to Washington's regularly updated list of wartime contributions, which includes 31 Abrams tanks, 45 T-72B tanks, 186 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, 20 Mi-17 helicopters, dozens of combat drones, lots of state-of-the-art satellite communications equipment, and more than 100,000 sets of body armor and helmets, President Biden has provided nearly $44 billion in military assistance to Ukraine thus far. Weapons are a critical part of warfare, that's obvious, but without resourcefulness, they will only take a conventional force so far, which makes the new tactic Ukrainian forces have been using against Russian tanks that much more impressive. To go along with their already proven yet more traditional ambush maneuvers, they've also developed a highly creative yet simple way of utilizing landmines. Essentially, as a Russian mine plow clears a path through a known minefield, Ukrainian troops will wait for it to pass, then toss fresh mines onto the same path right in front and sometimes behind the trailing convoy, effectively littering the cleared corridor with new mines. The vehicles following the mine plow end up hitting these mines or run over the mines as they try to escape the trap. To execute this brazen new maneuver, the Ukrainians have been utilizing two different types of mines. One is the Soviet TM62, the other is the American Remote Anti-Armor Mine System, or RAM, of which the US has donated more than 30,000. The 21-pound TM62 is what you think of when you think of a traditional mine, basically a big metal disc packed with explosives and fitted with some sort of fuse. The RAM, on the other hand, is slightly different and consists of 9 mines that are 4 pounds each, stacked together in a hollow 155mm artillery shell. With practice, Ukrainian troops have found that a few well-aimed volleys can scatter scores of these, each with a magnetic fuse, across a relatively wide area. This tactic has been a big success recently, as armored vehicles have continued to roll in neat lines across the fields and forests between the Russian-occupied cities of Pavlivka and Volodar. And what often happens, after the lead tank hits a mine and explodes, the rest of the column attempts to scatter. Some vehicles try to go around the wrecked lead vehicle, only to hit a mine themselves. In these scenarios, even retreat is dangerous, as there might be fresh mines now scattered behind the column, littered across the very path it used to come through. In the past weeks, in the region surrounding Volodar, the Russians have lost 30 or more armored vehicles, including a few tanks, and it seems that well-placed mines have largely been the cause. To defeat these tactics and save a few of their prized T-90s, Russia will need, at minimum, better intelligence and a more flexible command and control strategy. In theory, the narrow TM62 minefields shouldn't be that hard to avoid if the opposing force was able to, let's say, organize 24-hour surveillance and a reliable means of disseminating information to its frontline forces. And Russia will need exactly that if they want to keep ahead of Ukraine's clearly savvy military engineers. But what do you think? Have the technical shortcomings of the Russian T-90 been the primary cause of its poor performance? Or are these tanks being utilized poorly and judged unfairly? Also, how might foreign military aid and Ukraine's improvised tactics be contributing to the loss of so many Russian tanks? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.